Ned Stark stood in the great September of Baelor beneath the scorching King's Landing sun, feeling the stone beneath his knees. His wrists were bound, and a hush had fallen upon the throng of spectators who came to see how the Lannisters would handle the traitor who had, in their eyes, conspired against the crown. Yet, despite his predicament, Ned held his head high, steel-gray eyes scanning the crowd. He noticed the fear and uncertainty in his daughter Sansa's face, the anger and defiance in Arya's before she was whisked away, and the simmering glee in Joffrey's expression. Cersei, her lips pressed together in what might have been satisfaction or disapproval, stood just behind the boy king. When King Joffrey Baratheon, resplendent in a gilded tunic, announced the sentence, silence turned to a shocked ripple. Instead of calling for Ned Stark's head, Joffrey declared that Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, was to be stripped of all titles and sent to join the Night's Watch in permanent exile. The Watchers gasped. Some might have called it a mercy. Others thought it cunning cruelty. For Ned Stark, in that agonizing moment, the only relief he felt was that his daughters would not have to watch the gleaming sword of Island Pain separate his head from his shoulders. Under heavy guard, he was dragged to a black-sailed ship at the Blackwater Bay that would carry him to Eastwatch by the sea. It was not the path he had expected, but he could not help but feel a sliver of gratitude. His life was spared, and perhaps the old gods had given him a chance to right the wrongs and find a path to protect his family. The city's stench of rot and filth faded behind him, replaced by the salt-laden wind that tugged at his hair and cloak. Iron chains stayed locked around his wrists, but by the time he set foot on the deck, he was too tired to protest. Sometime during the journey, the Lannister men removed his chains. They had no fear that he would jump into the watery depths and swim home to the north, for these were no ordinary waters. The captain, hired by the crown but having no love for the Lannisters, observed Lord Stark with sympathy. On more than one occasion, the man offered him sips of warmed wine, which Ned politely refused until he realized it might soothe his pounding headache. Each night, Ned would find himself leaning against the rails, gazing up at the sky. The sea was wide and rough, but the glimmering stars above reminded him of winter nights in the courtyard at Winterfell. He clung to those memories. In them lay his sense of duty. He arrived at Eastwatch by the Sea to a reception of black-clad men. Stewards, builders, and rangers of the Night's Watch assembled under the watchful gaze of the commander at Eastwatch. Edging down the plank from the ship, Ned felt the biting chill in the air. In the distance, the vastness of the wall loomed high, a corridor of ice that seemed to rise like an insurmountable barrier between the realms of men and whatever lay beyond. The duty that this brotherhood upheld was no small thing. He had not intended to ever don the black, but he knew, deep in his bones, that it was an honorable calling. The men parted quietly as he passed, a murmur of recognition running among them. They bowed their heads with varying degrees of respect. Eddard Stark, traitor or not, was still the man who had once been Warden of the North. Without ceremony, Ned found himself escorted to the commander's solar. There stood a short, barrel-chested man with a plain face, apparently the officer in charge of Eastwatch. The man welcomed him with a curt nod. There was a tension in the air, for even though Ned had been condemned to the Watch, many in Black harbored respect for the erstwhile Lord of Winterfell. Few saw him as a traitor. Most believed him an honorable man, caught in the vile politics of King's Landing. But whatever their personal feelings, they bowed to their new brother. Ned felt the unfamiliar weight of the black cloak across his shoulders. The vow he recited still thundered in his mind. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. But these words brought him little comfort. He had never chosen this. A part of him found it painfully ironic. He had once beheaded a deserter of the Night's Watch in Winterfell's courtyard, explaining to his son Bran that the one who passes the sentence must swing the sword. And now, here he stood, forcibly sworn to a duty he had never pledged willingly. Still, if the realm required him, he would do what he could to keep it safe. For a time, that was enough. He began his duties in earnest, keeping a modest bunk among the Black brothers, rising before dawn to stand his watch along the top of the palisade at Eastwatch. The wind whipped at him like a living, howling creature, and he often felt the cold in his very bones. News from south of the neck reached them rarely, but when it came, it was always a swirl of half-truths and rumors. Men arriving to join the watch whispered that the realm was ablaze with conflict. Robb Stark, Ned's own son, had called the Northern Banners. War had begun in earnest. Tywin Lannister's hosts had clashed with the Tullys. Renly Baratheon had crowned himself king in Highgarden's fields. And, in the gloom of Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon was said to be gathering an army of his own. Every piece of news ached in Ned's heart. He thought of Catelyn and his children. He yearned to rush to their side. Yet he had made that vow, with the old gods as witnesses, to wear the black. Guilt gnawed at him, though he tried to silence it with the knowledge that he was powerless to help. And still, the realm's troubles continued to weigh upon him. Then, one bleak evening, a heavily cloaked messenger arrived by boat. The guards at the gate gave him entry, and the man insisted he bore a message for the man once known as Lord Eddard Stark. The fact that this traveler had come specifically seeking Ned was unusual enough to rouse caution among the Black brothers. But they permitted him a short, discreet meeting. In a small, torchlit chamber, Ned met the stranger, who revealed beneath his hood a face deeply lined by worry and cold. He handed Ned a sealed parchment, the wax bearing a stag's head sigil. The contents, once Ned read them by the wavering light of a single candle, shattered whatever quiet acceptance he had cultivated at Eastwatch. The letter was signed in a sharp, terse script. Stannis Baratheon, Lord of Dragonstone, King of the Undulls and the First Men by right of blood. In succinct lines, Stannis explained his claim, that Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella were the product of incest, not true Baratheons. That the Iron Throne belonged to Stannis himself as Robert's true heir. He declared that he had knowledge of Ned's innocence and that Ned Stark, as the rightful Warden of the North, was needed to save the realm from the false kings. The letter ended with a single line that burned into Ned's mind. Your country bleeds. Will you stand idle on the wall? Or will you bring the North to the true king? Ned sank onto a small stool and felt the weight of destiny come crashing down upon him. He could not deny that Joffrey's claim was false. He had risked his life in King's Landing precisely to expose that lie. For that, he had nearly lost his head. Now, he was trapped in black, and only a vow separated him from the family he was sworn by birth to protect. The letter's words had a certain ring of truth to them, at least insofar as Stannis's rightful claim was concerned. Ned had always believed that the line of succession should pass to the elder brother if Robert had left no trueborn offspring. He had no love for Stannis's rigid personality, but the man was correct in this. The realm was in chaos because of Lannister deceit. Weeks passed, and he carried the letter in the inner pocket of his cloak. He read and reread it many times, always telling himself that he was oath-bound to remain at the Wall, to renounce lands and titles, to never again play a part in the realm's wars. And each time, the letter called to him like a whisper of memory, speaking of duty to his family, duty to the North, duty to the truth. Meanwhile, ravens arrived with news of Robb's victories in the field. He had captured Jaime Lannister, rumor said, and was declared king in the North by his men. Another rumor spoke of Catelyn forging alliances, traveling to treat with Renly, or seeking an audience with the Lord of Riverrun, her father. The realm was truly aflame with kings. Ned's every thought was torn between the binding words of the Watch and the love he bore his children. Amid these swirling doubts, an incident shook Eastwatch. Rangers returning from a voyage beyond the Wall reported signs that the Whites were stirring, that the ancient legends of the others might not be mere fables. The commander feared an attack, or at least some dark movement in the far north. Tensions rose. Whispers circulated of unknown shadows in the forest. Ned might have believed his best course was to remain, to secure the defense of the realm from these potential terrors. Yet every time a new letter or rumor arrived, it pulled him south in spirit. Every night, the same question haunted him. Was he truly doing his best to protect the realm by standing guard here? Or did his family and King Stannis, for Ned now recognized him as the rightful heir, need him more? Gradually, a plan formed in Ned's mind. Though the vow to the Watch was sacred, He recognized that it had been forced on him by a false king. Did that make the vow any less binding? The old Ned Stark would have said no. A vow was a vow, but the new Ned Stark, broken in King's Landing, humiliated, seeing how the realm had suffered, found himself questioning that absolute notion. If Stannis, the rightful heir, needed him to set the realm to rights, was it not his duty to answer that call? If his own son Robb had taken up arms, was it not Ned's place to guide him? A father who let his son march alone was no father at all. Once the thought began, it snowballed with unstoppable force. Ned knew enough about the Watch to orchestrate a covert escape. It was said that desertion from the Night's Watch was punishable by death, but he also knew that the men here were not eager to see him as a common deserter. They respected him. Many had served in Winterfell's ranks or had known men who did, but that did not guarantee their cooperation. He confided in a select few, men who had once been Northerners themselves, men who carried in their hearts a loyalty to House Stark. Most were sworn to the Watch with their own vows, but they listened to him with quiet respect as he spoke of the realm's crisis. He was careful, for fear of being labeled a traitor anew, or worse, of leaving behind resentment that might cause strife among the Black Brothers. But these men understood something else. If the rightful king was to ascend the throne, and if the entire continent was threatened by war or by the dark creatures beyond the wall, perhaps the oath to serve the realm in black was not so different from the oath that would bring justice to the Seven Kingdoms. Late one night, under cover of a moonless sky, Ned Stark disappeared from Eastwatch by the sea. He left a short message for the commander, apologizing for breaking his vow, acknowledging that he would be forever labeled a deserter, but proclaiming he could not stand idle while his family and the true king faced the storm of war. "The realm must be saved from the Lannisters," he wrote, "and the others beyond the wall both. I go to unite the North." Then he slid onto a small boat with 2 loyal companions, men who found reason enough in their hearts to believe that Ned's cause outweighed the vow of neutrality. They rowed across the black waters until the lights of Eastwatch were naught but specks in the distance. They traveled by sea first, hugging the ragged coastline, hoping to avoid detection by any patrolling Lannister ships. Cold waves licked at the boat's sides, and storms nearly capsized them more than once. Still, Ned pressed on, leading them with a quiet determination that reminded his companions of the Wolf of Winterfell. When at last they could slip ashore near the Bay of Seals, Ned found himself standing on the stony beach of his homeland again. It was a battered, lonely stretch of coast, far from any major port. The pine trees rose at the edges of the shore, and the wind carried the scents of the north. Damp earth, salt, and a faint trace of pine sap. Despite the desperation of his journey, Ned felt his spirits lift at the taste of northern air on his tongue. From there, they traveled by foot and horseback through hidden trails, skirting the watchful eyes of any who might betray them to the Lannisters or Seven Hells, report them to the Night's Watch. They were a small band, traveling lightly, and they utilized Ned's knowledge of lesser-used roads to remain inconspicuous. A cloak dyed dull gray replaced his black. He carried no banner, yet in his heart, Ned Stark was rallying the North. They marched for days, resting in abandoned huts or hidden glens. Occasionally, they encountered local villagers, most of whom gaped at Ned in disbelief, for they had been told the Lord of Winterfell was as good as dead or locked away in the black forever. Word spread in hushed whispers. Ned Stark had returned, not as a ghost, but in flesh, and he bore dire tidings. As these rumors trickled through the countryside, men began to approach them. Some were old hunters who had served House Stark in their youth. Others were hedge knights who revered the Stark name and remembered the just rule of Eddard Stark. They brought meager supplies, offered their swords, or provided knowledge of safe houses. Ned, though wary, accepted their help. His immediate goal was to rally enough loyalists to ensure his message reached the major houses of the North. The Umbers, the Karstarks, the Mormonts, the Boltons, though the last gave Ned pause, for the Bolton words and reputation were cause for worry. Ultimately, he had to let them know he was alive and prepared to stand with Stannis Baratheon for the good of the realm. Soon, his small fellowship grew. A retinue of perhaps 30 men accompanied him, each dedicated to the idea that the false king on the Iron Throne must be dethroned, that King Stannis was the rightful heir, and that Eddard Stark had a duty to help. One evening, they camped in a pine grove lit by a brilliant moon. A pair of ravens soared overhead, and Ned felt an uneasy thrill in his heart. He knew that if the Night's Watch discovered his flight, they might brand him a deserter. He knew that if he were captured by the Lannisters, they would likely execute him. And yet, none of this touched the core of his resolve. The old gods were with him in that quiet glade. He could feel them in the towering pines, in the hush of the wind, in the silent stars overhead. He prayed to them for guidance, for a sign, and in the rustling leaves he seemed to hear them. Go south, Ned Stark, and bring the north with you. Traveling steadily, they drew closer to Winterfell. The holdfast that had once been Ned's seat seemed both near and impossibly far, layered with memories. He'd learned from stray travelers that his son, Robb Stark, was away in the Riverlands, waging war against the Lannisters. Winterfell itself was in the care of Maester Luwin and the small household guard that remained. Bran and Rickon were said to be within its walls. Hearing that reminded Ned of the ache in his chest. He had not even had time to warn them of his approach, nor to prepare them for what was coming. But he would not place them in harm's way. Indeed, he had half a mind to keep moving, to avoid Winterfell altogether, so that if the place were attacked for harboring a traitor, they could truthfully claim ignorance of him. In the end, love for his home overcame caution. Under the cover of night, Ned and his companions approached the walls of Winterfell by crossing the old causeway that spanned a slow-moving stream. The guards on duty, glimpsing the shapes in the dark, shouted a challenge. One of Ned's loyalists, an old man-at-arms who had once served in Winterfell's garrison, called out, "We bring Ned Stark, rightful lord of Winterfell, father to King Robb." The guards hesitated only a heartbeat, then rushed to open the gate. Torches flared. Men stumbled forward in shock, and a hush rippled through the courtyard. It was as though the very stones recognized Ned's presence. Maester Luwin, summoned from his chambers, came running. His maester's chain clattering around his neck, candlelight illuminating his worried face. In an instant, his wide eyes found Ned's. For a moment, both men simply stared, neither believing the scene truly before them. Then the maester rushed forward, clasping Ned's hand, tears brimming in his eyes. Wordlessly, Ned drew the older man into an embrace, as though to anchor himself to reality. He was home, at least for a night. A quick flurry of footsteps brought his youngest son, Rickon, into the courtyard, guided by two members of the household staff. The child gaped at his father, then barreled into him, sobbing that he thought his father was gone forever. Ned held Rickon tight and felt tears burn his own eyes. He had missed so much, had lost so much time. If only he could remain here, guiding his sons, protecting them as was his duty. But the letter from Stannis was pressed close to his heart, and the knowledge of the realm's strife weighed heavily on him. When at last he released Rickon, he asked after Bran. The boy was asleep, Luwin explained, still crippled from his fall, but better, day by day, in spirit if not in body. Ned breathed thanks to the old gods. Perhaps, come morning, he would see Bran. That very night, Ned gathered the few advisors who remained in Winterfell, Maester Luwin, Ser Roderick Castle, and several of the more senior household staff. By the flickering flames of the hearth, he explained what had transpired. His condemnation in King's Landing, his forced vow, his receipt of Stannis's letter, and, ultimately, his desertion from the Watch. Shock, anger, and concern mingled on their faces. Ser Roderick, that steady rock of a man, did not question Ned's choices. "My lord," he said, voice low but resolute, "we have long known the boy on the throne is not Baratheon. If Stannis calls for your support, he must have good reason. Robb has declared for the north. But might we not unite with Stannis to ensure the Lannisters are undone?" Maester Luwin frowned, weaving his fingers together. "Lord Stark, I understand the burden you bear, but deserting the Watch, it is not only a breach of vow, it places the entire North in jeopardy if the Watch cannot rely on Northern aid. The realm may judge you for it." Ned lowered his gaze. "I understand, Maester," But I cannot stand idle while my family fights and the realm crumbles under a false king. The old gods witness that I did not choose this lightly." He paused, then told them of what the rangers had reported. The whites, the danger stirring beyond the wall. "I do not mean to abandon the watch. If I can help Stannis secure the throne, he might provide the resources necessary to face what is coming in the north. We need a united realm if we're to survive." Ser Roderick's eyes hardened with understanding. "Then let us raise the banners, my lord. It may be that the best path to ensuring Winterfell's safety is to align with Stannis Baratheon. If Robb sees sense in it, we might form a common front." Ned felt the flicker of hope. It was not so simple to unify the North, but if his people believed in him, perhaps they would see that the ultimate goal was not to be king in the North, much as he adored his son's boldness. The North must protect itself from greater evils, but to do that, the false king had to be put aside, and the rightful king recognized. "I will speak with Robb," he said. "We must not let pride blind us. If the Lannisters are strong, the realm must be stronger. I will offer King Stannis the North swords if he will promise to drive the Lannisters back and prepare the realm for the real war yet to come." Word of Ned's return spread through the castle by morning. Bran was carried to him, tears in the boy's eyes. Ned knelt before his son, gently touching his face. A swirl of emotions overtook father and child alike. They had a precious few hours together, and in that time, Ned tried to give Bran what comfort he could. He explained that he must ride south to treat with Robb, that soon he would return. "Winterfell is in your care, Bran," Ned whispered. "You and Rickon must be strong. The North needs you." Bran clung to his father's hand, cheeks pale, but nodded bravely. "I will be strong," he said. "I promise." The next day, Ned ordered ravens sent to the great houses of the North, announcing that Eddard Stark yet lived, and that he called upon them for support in a cause that would see the false king undone and the realm united under the rightful heir of House Baratheon. He also wrote a private message to Robb, explaining how he escaped the Black, urging his son to consider alliance with Stannis, and expressing pride at Robb's feats so far. The letters were sealed with the direwolf sigil. Then, with Ser Roderick by his side and a small escort of loyal knights and guards, Ned mounted a fresh horse. The courtyard was alive with excitement, but also tension, for everyone knew that once Ned left Winterfell, there was no guarantee he would return. They set off south, traveling toward Moat Cailin. Along the way, they passed scattered settlements and small villages. Wherever news of his survival had arrived, local men would come forth, uncertain, wide-eyed. Some offered to join him on the spot. Others pledged supplies or hospitality. Over and over, Ned heard the refrain, "Thank the old gods you're alive, Lord Stark." The realm had thought him either dead or locked away forever. Now, seeing him move through the north, clad in dark gray leathers rather than black, gave hope or confusion to those who heard the call. Little by little, his escort grew. Hedge knights, free riders, and small folk who considered House Stark their liege lord joined. Soon, they bore a banner once more, the gray direwolf on a field of white, though many whispered that Ned Stark, forced to the wall, had no right to call himself lord. The more fervent supporters argued that a vow made under duress, to a false king, need not be honored when the realm itself was at stake. Whichever side men took, Ned Stark was forging ahead. When they reached Moat Cailin, they found a small garrison of men wearing the direwolf sigil. Some had been left behind by Robb to guard the North's entrance against any southern incursion. The commander there, an older officer named Osric, was stunned at Ned's appearance but greeted him with deep respect. "My lord," he said, voice trembling, "you've come back. By the gods, if Robb hears of this—" "He will," Ned said gently, dismounting, "and I must see him as soon as I can. I will ride on the morrow, but for this night, let us rest." The men are weary. They camped at Moat Cailin, the broken towers looming in the moonlight. Ned stared at those ancient stones that had once guarded the North from invasion. His thoughts drifted to his father, Rickard Stark, to Brandon, to Lyanna, all gone. He thought of Robert Baratheon, his old friend, now gone as well. And in all that loss, there was a single resolute truth. Ned had a chance to protect what remained, to stand for the living, to uphold the legacy of House Stark. In the morning, their party continued. As they neared the neck, the terrain grew wet and boggy. Swarms of midges hovered above pools of stagnant water, and the causeways were precarious. None of that deterred Ned, for the will driving him forward was stronger than the gloom of the marshes. Once through the neck, they would be crossing into the riverlands. That was where Robb Stark was said to be leading the northern host. The prospect of reuniting with his son filled Ned with both relief and apprehension. He had so much to explain, so many words to convey. Finally, they entered the riverlands. Signs of war were everywhere. Burned farms, battered holdfasts, fields trampled by the passage of armies. Ned felt his stomach clench at the sight. This was the price of conflict. The Starks tried to wage an honorable war, but war was seldom kind to the small folk. Cautiously, they made their way south until they encountered a forward patrol wearing the direwolf sigil. The men, upon realizing that the tall, bearded man before them was Eddard Stark, nearly fell off their horses in shock. Immediately, they offered to escort him to Robb's main camp. Word must have traveled ahead of them, because when they arrived at the sprawling encampment near the Twins, the Frey stronghold, though Ned was told Walder Frey had somewhat reluctantly aided Robb, hundreds of northern soldiers paused in their tasks, eyes snapping toward Ned in disbelief. A hush, then a roar rippled through the throng. Men called his name in wonder, exclaiming that the Lord of Winterfell had come back from the dead. Others pressed forward for a closer look, tears or broad grins lighting their faces. Ned had to wave them aside gently, urging them to let him pass. Then Robb appeared, taller than Ned remembered. His son strode out of a large command tent, Grey Wind at his side. The direwolf snarled at first, but when Grey Wind caught Ned's scent, the snarl faded to a baffled rumble. Robb froze, disbelief etched in every line of his young face. His kingly mantle of authority faltered for a heartbeat as father and son locked eyes. Then Robb was running to him, arms outstretched, voice cracking with a single word. "Father!" They embraced, father and son, tears and laughter and shock tangling together. Grey Wind stood at their side, sniffing Ned, letting out what sounded like a reproachful whine, as though asking where Ned had been and why he smelled of the sea and of the far north. Soldiers around them erupted in cheers and clamor, though some were too stunned to do more than watch. After a long, trembling moment, Robb pulled back, his voice raw. I was told you were a traitor, that you were executed, that I was sentenced to the black," Ned corrected quietly. "But I could not remain there. I know what you've done, Robb, and I am proud of you. The North has declared you king, and I know you have fought bravely and well. But hear me out. There is more at stake than just the North's independence." Robb's eyes flickered with confusion. The young man waved over several lords to join them in the tent. The Great John, Roose Bolton, Rickard Karstark, and others came forward. They regarded Ned with a mixture of respect and wariness. Some believed in Robb as king in the North, and seeing Ned return might complicate that dynamic. Inside the tent, once the flaps were drawn, Ned explained everything, from his forced vow to the letter from Stannis Baratheon. As he spoke, the lords listened with varying expressions. The Great John rumbled that if Stannis wanted the North swords, he'd have to fight for them. Others, however, recognized that the real threat might come from the Lannisters and the uncertain future if every Baratheon brother crowned himself. Robb stared at the parchment. "He claims the Iron Throne as Robert's true heir," he muttered. "I have declared the North free. It was not a decision I made lightly, father." Ned inclined his head. "I understand, Robb, but consider what a fractured realm means. The Lannisters will not rest until they crush you. The Greyjoys might see our distraction as a chance to strike. And if the stories from beyond the wall are true..." He trailed off, letting the meaning hang in the air. "We need unity under a king who is truly Robert's heir. Stannis is not a man I love, but he is just, and I believe the realm will rally behind him once they see the truth of Joffrey's parentage." Murmurs rose among the assembled lords. Some outright objected, how dare they bend the knee after proclaiming the king in the north. Others saw the sense in forging an alliance with Stannis to destroy the Lannisters, though what that meant for the North's independence was unclear. Meanwhile, Ned locked eyes with Robb. "You have done what you thought best, my son, and perhaps, if the realm was not in such dire peril, the North could stand alone. But the war is greater now." Robb pressed his lips together. He was young, but the war had already aged him. He seemed torn between pride and the practicalities of war. Grey Wind sensed his tension, growling low. At last, Robb sighed, turning to address the gathered lords. "My father has seen that the kingdom is threatened by the Lannisters, and worse. We have raised our banners in the name of the North, in the name of justice. If Stannis can provide the justice we seek, if he will avenge our grievances, uphold our freedoms, and prepare for the true threat in the North, then perhaps we can join forces." The Great John slammed a fist on the table. "We crowned you king in the North. If we bow to Stannis, the men might see it as betrayal." Ned spoke softly. "Your loyalty to my son does you credit, but it is not betrayal to unify for the sake of the realm. Sometimes the wolf must join forces with the stag to hunt the lion. What matters is that the North remains protected, and Stannis will have no easy time winning hearts in the South, I suspect. He needs the men of the North to lend him legitimacy, to show that honorable men side with him." Roose Bolton, silent till now, cleared his throat. His voice was soft, measured. "If King Robb and Lord Eddard can extract assurances from Stannis, promises that the North will not be exploited, that certain freedoms will be preserved, then perhaps we might consider. But you must realize, my lord, that for all that talk, the Lannisters remain a threat. We must move quickly." The conversation continued deep into the night, with arguments swirling like a storm. Ned's desertion from the Watch was brushed aside as a formality, for these men cared more about the war at hand than the intricacies of vows forced upon him by a false king. The deeper question was whether the North should maintain its new crown under Robb or yield to Stannis' rightful claim. Ned was not blind to the heartbreak this posed for his son. Robb had marched south to avenge his father, to rescue his sisters, and to protect his homeland. He had been acclaimed king in the North by banners who swore they would never bow to the South again. For him to kneel now, would that not be a repudiation of the men who had bled for his cause? Yet the alternative was a fractured realm, with Stannis fighting for the throne, Renly proclaiming himself king in the South, and the Lannisters cunningly entrenching their power around the Iron Throne. And all the while, the real danger loomed in the far north. Ned remembered the chilling corpses that rose again, the pale spiders of legend the old stories spoke of. If those stories were even half true, the living must unite. In the end, a strategy began to take shape. Ned Stark would ride with a contingent of northern lords to meet with Stannis Baratheon, likely at Storm's End, Dragonstone, or wherever Stannis was gathering his banners. Robb would continue to press the Lannisters, ensuring they could not reinforce King's Landing. If an alliance could be forged, then, as father and son, Ned and Robb would unify their forces to end Lannister rule. After that, the question of kingship would be decided by the sword or by negotiation. The men in the tent all recognized that it was a gamble. When at last the assembled leaders dispersed into the night, father and son remained in the tent. Robb seemed exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He studied Ned's face, as though searching for reassurance. "I always believed you to be the most honorable man in the Seven Kingdoms," Robb said quietly. "You taught me to hold to my oaths. Now you have broken one. But I cannot blame you, father. The vow was forced, and the realm has greater need of you." Ned's voice was hushed, tinged with regret. "I do not relish being a deserter. I know the Watch will brand me as such. If Jeor Mormont yet commands at Castle Black, perhaps he will understand. But it was the only way I saw to protect you and Bran and Sansa, all my children, and the realm itself." Robb nodded slowly. A silence stretched between them. Then he drew a deep breath. "Father, I missed you." The words came out as a child's confession, filled with longing. Ned reached out, clasping Rob's shoulder. He looked upon his son, who was now a king to many, yet still so young. "I missed you too," Ned said, voice trembling. "You have done well. None of this is easy, and I am sorry the burden has fallen on you. But we will see this through together." That night, Ned found a quiet corner of the camp to sleep. The smell of wood smoke and damp grass surrounded him. Men murmured outside in hushed voices, discussing the day's revelations. Some cheered the news that Ned Stark was alive. Others worried about what it might mean for the king in the North's authority. War cast a long shadow over them all. Nevertheless, Ned felt a sliver of hope, a warmth in his heart that he had not felt since leaving King's Landing. He was with his son. They had a plan, however precarious. The North would not stand alone in ignorance of the rightful king, nor would the threat beyond the wall be dismissed. In the days that followed, Ned wasted no time. He wrote a reply to Stannis, sealing it with the direwolf of House Stark, proclaiming his willingness to parley, to lend him support if he proved himself worthy of the Iron Throne in truth and deed. He made it clear that the North expected recognition and respect, and that if Stannis was to claim the fealty of Winterfell, he must vow to stand against the White Walkers should they invade. Once that raven flew, Ned mounted his horse. Along with a retinue of seasoned men, he set off on the long march to treat with Stannis. On the field, the northern host rumbled forward in multiple columns, some going to secure the Riverlands, others to contain Tywin Lannister's movements. Ned traveled with a smaller escort to the coast, where ships from White Harbor might ferry him to Dragonstone if needed. The journey was fraught with danger. Pockets of Lannister scouts roamed the countryside, desperate to gather intelligence or sabotage the northern cause. But the determination in Ned's eyes and the loyalty of the men at his side dispelled any notion of turning back. Each morning, Ned rose with the sun, remembering his vow to the Watch, remembering how he had once believed that vow would end his part in the realm's power struggles. Instead, it had catapulted him into the thick of it. But this was the path the gods had laid before him. As he traveled, more villagers came forward, telling him of Lannister outrages or bandit raids. He told them to hold fast, that justice would come. And they believed, for they saw the mark of House Stark. They heard the calm conviction in Ned's voice. He was not a showy man, but men believed in him. After weeks on the road, the retinue arrived at a stretch of the coast rumored to be near where a group of Lysene ships, possibly allied to Stannis, had been spotted. With luck, Ned would find a vessel to carry him onward. Word came that Stannis was amassing a force at Storm's End now, having left Dragonstone to solidify his claim in the Stormlands. If that were true, Ned intended to sail for Storm's End, braving the ship's route around Dorne's southern waters or traveling up the Blackwater. Either way, the path would be perilous. Late one afternoon, while the sun dipped below the horizon in a blaze of orange, Ned found himself standing on a windswept cliff, gazing out over the roiling sea. He clutched the black cloak that had once belonged to the Watch. He had kept it as a reminder of the vow he'd been forced to take, and the vow he now broke in hopes of saving the realm. The wind whipped around him, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. Far below, waves crashed violently against jagged rocks. In that moment, the deep sense of foreboding that had haunted him since King's Landing returned. War was an ugly business, and forging alliances with men as stern and merciless as Stannis was no small matter. But it was the lesser evil compared to letting the Lannisters continue unchecked. He knew well that, in the eyes of the world, he was a man with a tarnished honor now. Once the Warden of the North, then a prisoner, then a black brother, and now a deserter. But if that was the cost of safeguarding his family and the greater good, so be it. Honor was not always found in keeping a vow forced upon you by tyrants. Sometimes it lay in protecting those who could not protect themselves. Behind him, several of his companions spoke in low tones, discussing the next leg of their journey. Ned turned, stepping away from the cliff's edge, letting his black cloak settle around him. He looked at their expectant faces. Men who had chosen to follow him, men who believed the Wolf of Winterfell could still guide them to victory. "We sail at first light," he said quietly. They nodded, though some seemed uneasy at the thought of what awaited them. One man approached Ned. "My lord, do you trust Stannis? He is said to be a hard man, unyielding." Ned's mouth formed a thin line. "Trust is hard to come by in these times. But I trust the law, I trust the truth, and I trust that if Stannis holds the rightful claim, he will see this war done properly. Let us hope we can make him see reason." As Ned settled himself by the campfire that night, he reflected on all that had happened. The day in the great September of Baelor when he knelt, believing he was about to die, the cold deck of the ship to Eastwatch by the sea, the vow to the watch under duress, the letter from Stannis that ignited a spark of resolve in his heart. Through all the trials, he felt the presence of his family within him, urging him onward. He silently vowed that once he treated with Stannis, once the Lannisters were driven back, he would not forget the real threat beyond the wall. He would see that the 7 kingdoms he loved were not left in ignorance of the nightmares stirring in the far north. As the stars glittered overhead, Ned drifted to sleep. No matter what name men might give him, traitor, deserter, oathbreaker, he still carried the name Stark in his heart. He had left the black behind him, yes, but his sense of duty to the realm remained. And in that sense of duty was a fierceness born of the north, a resolve that no harsh winter's wind could quell. Come morning, he would board a ship and sail south, forging an uncertain alliance with Stannis Baratheon. The path ahead was fraught with peril, for the Lannisters would no doubt seek his head again, and not all of the North's lords would readily accept bending the knee to another southern king. With that knowledge, he rose the next day and prepared to face the sea. The black cloak he'd worn was now little more than a memory of what might have been. His new path lay before him in the shape of rolling waves and the promise of an alliance that could either save the realm or plunge it into further chaos. Yet Ned Stark would meet that challenge as he had every other in his life, with quiet resolve, guided by the principles of honor, family, and duty that had shaped him since boyhood. And so began this new chapter of the realm's history, where the wolf, no longer caged by the black, would seek out the stag and together attempt to slay the lion, not for personal glory, but to protect the 7 kingdoms from the storms and shadows yet to come. Ned Stark stood in the courtyard of Storm's End beneath a flat gray sky, tasting salt on the wind that blew in off Shipbreaker Bay. The massive fortress loomed behind him, a testament to House Baratheon's defiance in the face of past sieges. Once, he had besieged this castle himself in Robert's name during the rebellion that toppled the Targaryens. How strange that life should bring him back here, not in Robert's shadow, but as an ally, some would say co-conspirator, of Stannis Baratheon, Robert's surviving brother and the man Ned had come to believe was the rightful king. At his side stood Robb Stark, his son and king in the north to many. Robb's tall frame carried a regal air. The boy who had run in Winterfell's courtyards with his siblings was long gone, replaced by a commander of men. Ned saw both pride and burden in his son's eyes. So young, Ned thought to carry the weight of the north. But the realm had demanded it, and Robb had answered with steel. Grey Wind, the great direwolf, prowled near Robb's feet, sniffing at the damp air. Stannis Baratheon regarded father and son with the same stony composure that seemed eternally chiseled onto his features. His jaw was set in rigid lines, and though his mouth seldom curved upward, Ned believed he saw a flicker of satisfaction. A few feet behind him stood Ser Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight, who listened intently but said nothing. Other lords, sworn to Stannis, gathered in the courtyard, lords from the Stormlands who had bent the knee to the man they now called King Stannis, knights from smaller houses who had fought for him at the Battle of the Blackwater in a different turning of events, and mercenaries from the free cities who had drifted to Storm's End like moths to a flame, hoping to profit from the chaos. Chaos indeed, Ned thought grimly. The entire realm was rent by war, with the Iron Throne occupied by Joffrey Baratheon, a boy Ned believed was not Robert's trueborn son. The Lannisters clutched at power, but their hold was precarious. Meanwhile, Stannis's claim was legitimate by every law of succession. And yet they were not alone in seeking change. In the Vale, some lords had begun stirring, guided by new alliances. Renly Baratheon, once another contender, was gone, slain, under uncertain circumstances. Many of his bannermen had turned to Stannis, albeit reluctantly, or else fled to safer vantage points, waiting to see which way the winds would blow. All of these disparate powers were converging now in a single great movement. A plan to march on King's Landing and rip Joffrey off the Iron Throne. Ned had once believed himself done with the entanglements of war. He had been exiled to the Night's Watch, forced to don the black. Yet he had fled that captivity because duty compelled him. He would not stand idle while his family bled and the realm was torn apart by false kings and Lannister intrigue. Honor was not always in abiding by forced vows. It was in doing what was right to save the realm. Now, here he was, forging an alliance that might be the realm's best hope to end the Lannisters' hold. In the courtyard, Stannis' voice cut through the sea breeze. "We march at dawn. My scouts have word that Tywin Lannister is pinned near Harrenhal." He moves slowly, uncertain of which threat to face first. The men from King's Landing have holed up behind the walls, trusting in their gold and their walls to keep them safe. His lips thinned with displeasure. "We will show them they have misplaced their trust." Robb stiffened. "My men have engaged the Lannisters across the Trident. Lord Bolton and Lord Karstark push them from the north, while my uncles, Blackfish Tully in Riverrun and Edmure Tully, hold the Riverlands. The Lannisters have bled, but they are not yet broken. If we aim for King's Landing, Tywin may try to intercept." Stannis nodded curtly. "He may or he may choose to protect his base in the west. If he tries to return to the capital, we shall cut him off. My advanced scouts have found roads that will allow us to strike quickly. I have the advantage on the waters should it come to that. Your father," he said, gesturing to Ned, "knows the Crownlands and the Stormlands from past campaigns. His counsel is invaluable." Ned could not help but recall the last time he had ridden from Storm's End with an army. It was in the days of Robert's Rebellion, when everything felt simpler, if war could ever be called simple. He was only a young lord then, following a friend he loved like a brother. They had not expected all the heartbreak and bloodshed that followed. Now that friend was dead, and Ned stood with Robert's older brother, forging a different kind of brotherhood, one based on necessity and truth. Stannis turned toward a new arrival coming through the gate, and the entire courtyard seemed to hold its breath. There, astride a dappled courser, was Lord Yohn Royce of the Vale, flanked by a column of knights bearing the sigil of House Royce. Bronze armor, runic designs hammered into their plate. Behind them, more standards billowed in the wind. The black and white crescent of House Corbray, the moon and falcon of House Arryn. These were the Knights of the Vale at last heeding the call. For too long, the Vale had remained aloof under Lady Lisa Arryn's rule. But times changed, alliances shifted. Whether it was because Lisa had been unseated, or because Lord Royce had taken matters into his own hands, or because little Lord Robert was now under different counsel, it mattered little. They had arrived. Lord Yohn Royce dismounted, his face serious. "King Stannis, Lord Eddard Stark, King Robb, I come on behalf of the Vale to pledge our swords in this struggle. We can no longer watch the realm tear itself apart from behind the bloody gate. The Knights of the Vale stand with you against the false King Joffrey and his Lannister masters." A ripple of relief spread through the assembled lords. The Vale's support was crucial. Its knights were famed for their discipline and skill. Ned stepped forward, clasping Yohn's forearm in a warrior's greeting. "Your presence gladdens my heart, Lord Royce. I only regret it has come to war to bring us together." Royce inclined his head. "You have always had allies in the Vale, Lord Stark, even if certain individuals delayed the call to arms. Let us hope that we can bring an end to the Lannister stranglehold swiftly, so the Vale, the North, the Stormlands, and the rest of the realm can find peace." Stannis surveyed the banners of the Vale with grim approval. "We sail the narrow sea or march the Rose Road. It makes no difference to me. The city will fall if we come at it in force, but I intend to see that it falls to me by right. I trust this is understood." Attention flickered in the air. Robb's men had declared him king in the north. Would they truly kneel to Stannis once the dust settled? And the Vale's knights had a long tradition of following the Arryns, not a Baratheon. Yet necessity had forged this alliance. They all understood that unless Joffrey was dislodged from the throne, the Lannisters would remain dangerously in power, and the realm would be cursed to endless conflict. There was also the looming threat of a harsh winter and rumors of far darker things stirring beyond the wall, though few in the south believed those tales. Ned believed. He had seen enough to know the old nightmares were real. Robb's voice emerged with kingly resolve, though a subtle softness touched his expression. For now we fight together, King Stannis. That much is certain. My men will uphold our side of the plan. When the time comes to address questions of crowns and kingdoms, I trust we will do so honorably. Stannis gave the barest nod of acknowledgement, his mouth tightening. Honorably, he said. Yes. With that unsteady agreement reached, the combined forces prepared for departure. The courtyard filled with the clang of armor and the shouts of sergeants calling men into formation. Ned moved through the throng, ensuring everything was in order. The Northmen formed under Stark banners, a proud sight of gray direwolves on white fields. The Knights of the Vale assembled under their own sigils, bright falcons, runes, and suns displayed on painted shields. The Baratheon force, proudly bearing the crowned stag on gold, marched at the front with Stannis' own personal guard. Beyond that, sellswords from the free cities, Stormland levies, and small contingents from Tarth and other islands dotted the crowd. It was a strange mosaic of banners, bound together by a single imperative, the fall of House Lannister's puppet king. From a balcony overhead, Edric Storm, Robert Baratheon's acknowledged bastard, watched with wide eyes. The boy was of an age with Bran or Rickon, and Ned felt a pang for the path the child might have taken in a peaceful realm. He wondered if Stannis intended to make use of the boy's claim or keep him close as a ward. For now, there was little time to dwell on it. The horns sounded, and the gates of Storm's End opened, revealing the wide terrain of the Stormlands beyond. The grand host lurched into motion, a river of steel and banners. Their plan was twofold. Stannis' ships would patrol the coast, threatening to blockade King's Landing from the sea. Some of his men and a small force of Northmen, used to the rigors of travel, would move swiftly along the coastal roads, hoping to outmaneuver or at least confuse any Lannister scouts. Meanwhile, the main body of the army, Stannis, Ned, Robb, the Vale Knights, would march in a more direct route toward the capital, forging a path through the Crownlands. If Tywin tried to converge on King's Landing to defend it, they would face him together. If not, they would lay siege to the city. The Knights of the Vale, with their cavalry, would be pivotal in any open field engagement. And the northern foot soldiers were no small threat either. During the march, Ned found himself sharing conversation with Lord Yohn Royce. They spoke of old times, recalling the close ties between the Vale and the North under Jon Arryn's stewardship. When Jon Arryn still lived, a certain balance had been maintained in the realm. But once he was murdered, everything spiraled. Ned still felt a deep sadness for the old man, who had fostered both him and Robert in the Vale. The irony was not lost on him. All those bonds, so carefully woven, had unraveled. Now they were forging new ones in blood and necessity. At camp each evening, the flicker of campfires spread across the fields like 1,000 stars. Men swapped stories, sharpened blades, and dreamed of victory or dreaded what the morrow might hold. Some of the Vale Knights, used to mountainous terrain, grumbled about the marshy patches near the Windwater. Northmen bemoaned the heat that lingered even in early autumn so far south. Stannis' soldiers maintained a disciplined quiet, scurrying about their tasks with single-minded efficiency. In the command tent, candles burned late into the night as Ned, Stannis, Robb, and their advisors pored over maps, debated routes, and anticipated the Lannister moves. Ser Davos often attended these councils, leaning over the table, his brow furrowed. He would point to potential landing sites along the coast or inland waterways, explaining how swiftly his smuggler's sense told him supplies could be moved. Robb listened, occasionally exchanging glances with Ned, who sometimes offered a strategic memory from Robert's rebellion. How Tywin had moved, how large hosts fared on the roads, which lords in the Crownlands might turn cloak if properly convinced. More than once, Ned recalled the horrors of sacking King's Landing. He had arrived too late to stop Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorch from committing atrocities in the Lannisters' name. He vowed silently that this time would be different. Gradually, the combined host approached the edges of the Crownlands. Fields turned more prosperous, dotted with vineyards and orchards. Villages grew more frequent, though many were abandoned. Small folk fled, fearing the arrival of armies. Some Lannister forces had raised a few settlements in a scorched earth tactic, leaving behind blackened timbers and smoldering ruins. At each such sight, Ned felt his anger kindle anew. The small folk suffered most in these power struggles. He wanted an end to it. Even Stannis, harsh though he was, seemed to share the sentiment of wanting a swift resolution. Word reached them that Tywin Lannister remained in the western parts of the Riverlands, uncertain whether to move toward Harrenhal or to circle back to the capital. Riverrun forces harassed him from the east, while a vanguard of Robb's men advanced from the north. The old lion might yet turn, but time was slipping away. If he waited too long, the capital would be besieged. If he hurried back, he risked leaving the west undefended. For once, the Lannister patriarch faced a war on multiple fronts orchestrated by leaders not easily cowed. Yet the greatest challenge lay within King's Landing itself. The thick walls, the thousands of gold cloaks loyal to the Lannisters' coin, and the rumors that wildfire caches still hid beneath the city. Stannis had faced wildfire before on the Blackwater. It had spelled his defeat in another turning of events. This time he was determined to avoid a repeat. Every night, he conversed grimly with his lords about how to anticipate the pyromancer's cunning. The presence of the Vale Knights was also a new factor. If they could storm the city from multiple gates while Stannis' fleet blockaded Blackwater Bay, perhaps the Lannisters would be cornered. But cornered lions were the most dangerous. One afternoon, as the host made camp by a shallow river, Ned walked the perimeter, checking the men's morale. He encountered a group of Vale Knights practicing drills. Their swords rang with practiced strokes, reflections of the sun dancing across steel. Then he found Robb with a handful of Northern Bannermen, Rickard Karstark, the great John Umber, and a few others, discussing the near-constant skirmishes with Lannister outriders. Grey Wind lay at Robb's feet, ears twitching. When Ned approached, Karstark bowed his head respectfully. "Lord Stark," Karstark greeted, then added, "My king." To Robb with a stiff nod, "We caught 3 Lannister scouts. They were trying to slip behind our lines. We've gleaned little from them, but we suspect there's a small force ahead of us, maybe 2 or 3 days' ride from the city, meant to slow our approach." Robb's expression darkened. "We cannot let them stall us. Every day we linger is another day Joffrey has to strengthen the city's defenses." Ned frowned. "We must also consider that an ambush might be in the offing. The Crownlands have pockets of loyal lords to the Targaryens, and now perhaps to the Lannisters, though many are simply afraid. We can ill afford to charge blindly." They deliberated and ultimately agreed that a detachment of Vale Knights, led by Lord Royce, would scout further ahead and deal with any Lannister outriders. Meanwhile, the main force would proceed in good order, swift but not reckless. There was no shortage of caution in Ned's mind. He remembered too well how cunning Tywin Lannister could be. The next morning, the knights rode out, hooves thundering over the soil. A hush fell over the camp once the column departed, as though the men collectively waited for news of success or of tragedy. Ned took a position near the front of the marching army alongside Stannis, Ser Davos, Robb, and a handful of other lords. The air crackled with tension. Clouds began to gather overhead, threatening a storm that would turn the roads to mud. Ned silently prayed it would hold off. War in the rain was a miserable affair. By midday, horns sounded in the distance. A scout galloped into view, dust trailing behind his horse. The man reined in sharply before Stannis, dismounting with a salute. "Your Grace," he panted. Lord Royce encountered a Lannister raiding party near the Wendwater. They engaged. The Vale Knights proved too strong. The Lannisters are scattering west, retreating toward the Rose Road. We counted minimal losses among our men. Lord Royce sends word that we have a clear path to King's Landing. For now. A ripple of excitement swept through the gathered lords. Stannis's eyes burned with fierce satisfaction. Then we push forward. We'll make camp tonight closer to the city's outskirts, and be at the gates by midday tomorrow or the day after, depending on the roads. He glanced at Ned and Robb. Let us see if the false king shakes behind his walls. The combined host pressed on, pace quickening, ignoring the drizzle that soon began to fall. The men's boots churned the damp earth. Wagons groaned under the weight of supplies, but none faltered. By late afternoon, the outer farmland of King's Landing came into view, a patchwork of fields and pastures that had once fed the capital. Now they lay largely untended, for the approach of war had driven the small folk to seek shelter inside the city or flee deeper inland. A line of scrawny refugees trudged along one of the roads, battered by the rain. Some looked at the passing soldiers with hollow eyes. They had no love for Lannisters or Baratheons or Starks, only fear for their families. Ned's heart clenched at the sight, but there was nothing he could do in that moment except to order any baggage train to share what little extra food they could spare. The next morning dawned bleak and gray, the city's walls barely visible through the haze of drizzle. Sprawled along the Blackwater Rush, King's Landing rose like a mottled labyrinth of towers and walls, overshadowed by the Red Keep perched upon Aegon's high hill. Even from a distance, Ned could see the gold-capped spires of the Great September of Baelor, the 7 bridges crossing the Rush, the sprawl of stinking hovels beyond the city walls that had grown over the years. He recalled the last time he had stood in these fields. Then, he had been Hand of the King, believing in the justice of the law. How little had changed, and yet how everything had. Small skirmishes broke out as the forward elements of their host discovered gold cloak pickets or Lannister outriders. The clang of steel drifted across the wet morning air. Robb kept his men in disciplined ranks, commanding from the saddle with a composure beyond his years. Stannis moved among his own soldiers, hawk-eyed, ensuring none strayed or lost their nerve. The Vale Knights formed a protective wedge on one flank, their banners snapping in the breeze. Further out, horns sounded, marking the approach of the Baratheon fleet from the bay. If all went according to plan, the city would be encircled by land and sea. This was the beginning of the siege. They halted just out of arrow range, forming a sprawling semicircle around the city. Pikes were driven into the ground, tents hastily erected, and siege engines, hurriedly constructed from the lumber they had brought, began to take shape. Stannis had no illusions that this would be easy. The walls were formidable, the defenders numerous. Yet the defenders' morale might be brittle if they realized how precarious their situation truly was. And if rumor spread that Ned Stark had revealed the truth of Joffrey's parentage, perhaps some gold cloaks would lay down their arms. Late in the afternoon, a group of riders emerged from the city gates under a white banner, splashing through puddles along the road. They halted before the Baratheon lines. Stannis, Ned, Robb, and a handful of retainers rode out to meet them. The Lannister envoys wore fine cloaks, the lead man with a lion's sigil pinned at his shoulder. He dismounted, face taut. "I come on behalf of King Joffrey Baratheon," he began with forced bravado, "to demand that you withdraw from these lands at once. You stand in rebellion against the crown." Stannis's expression could have cracked stone. "The boy you call king is no Baratheon. He is a product of incest, the spawn of Jaime and Cersei Lannister. I have the documents and the testimony to prove it. The rightful throne is mine by law." The envoy bristled, eyes flicking from Stannis to Ned. Recognition flared. "Ned Stark, once Hand of the King. Lord Stark, you are an attainted traitor to the crown, and Robb Stark, crowned king in the north. The city knows of your duplicity. This will be your last chance to spare yourselves and your men. Bend the knee, pledge fealty to King Joffrey, or prepare to face the consequences." Robb's hand tightened on his reins. Grey Wind, standing close, bared his teeth, growling low. Ned's voice came out cold. "You speak empty words for a boy who is no rightful king. We have no intention of leaving. The Lannisters hold the city unlawfully, and the realm knows it. Open the gates, surrender your arms, and no harm shall come to the small folk. or we will take the city by force." The envoy sputtered. One of his companions tugged anxiously at his reins, as though eager to flee. Finally, the lead envoy spat, "Then you leave us no choice. King Joffrey will answer you with fire and blood. May the gods have mercy on your souls." He spun on his heel and they galloped back toward the city. No parley was possible. As they rode back to their lines, Stannis muttered to Ned, "So be it. We do this the hard way." He cast a glance at the walls, the gatehouse bristling with archers, scorpions, and boiling oil cauldrons. Let us see if Joffrey's courage matches his threats. Over the following days, the siege lines tightened. Stannis arrayed his forces across the main gates, constructing mantlets and siege towers. Robb's Northmen secured the roads leading out from the Dragon Gate and the Old Gate, ensuring no Lannister reinforcements could slip in or out. The Vale Knights scouted the higher ground to the northeast, preventing any attempts at breakout. Meanwhile, from the bay, Stannis' fleet extended a blockade. Warships flying the flaming heart of Stannis patrolled the waters, intercepting supply vessels. Rumor spread that some within the city were already hoarding grain, anticipating a prolonged siege. Inside the camps, tension grew. Men remembered the tales of wildfire used by Tyrion Lannister in another battle. They feared that caches might be ignited beneath them at any moment. Stannis was not one to succumb to fear, but he was pragmatic, ordering his men to dig trenches and erect palisades at a safe distance from the city walls, so as not to present an easy target for hidden stores of the alchemical fire. Ned found himself in constant motion, meeting with subcommanders, ensuring archers had vantage points, coordinating supply lines with White Harbor ships that had sailed south to support the blockade. In all of it, a sense of grim purpose guided him. He had returned to King's Landing, not as a supplicant or a prisoner, but as a liberator, if that was the word for it. Robb, for his part, found himself tested by the complexities of a siege. As a field commander, he excelled in swift maneuvers and battles in open country. A siege was a slower, more grueling business, requiring patience and negotiation as much as bravery. Some of his men chafed at waiting. The Great John in particular was eager to storm the walls, but the city's defenses were strong. Robb, guided by Ned and the older lords, refused to throw away lives in a reckless assault. "Let them starve," Great John grumbled. "Soon enough, the gold lovers will taste hunger, and the gates will open." But hunger was a double-edged sword. It affected the small folk most of all. That concern plagued Ned at night. The siege might turn the city's population against Joffrey, or it might simply bring suffering on tens of thousands. Stannis sometimes spoke of a quick assault, hoping to minimize the city's time under siege. Yet the cost in blood could be enormous. Every day, the leaders debated, balancing the desire for a swift victory with the desire to preserve as many lives as they could. On the fourth day, the defenders tested their might. A force of gold cloaks and Lannister men-at-arms sallied forth from the King's Gate in a sudden break of dawn. The assault struck the portion of the siege lines held by the Stormlanders. For a time, chaos reigned. War cries, the clash of steel, the whistling of arrows. Ned raced to that front with a detachment of Northmen, while Stannis led a disciplined countercharge. The Vale Knights thundered in from the flank, lances lowered, crashing into the Lannister lines like an iron fist. Within an hour, the sally was driven back, the gates slamming shut again behind the retreating gold cloaks. Though they won the engagement, the cost was real. Dozens of men on both sides lay dead in the mud. Ned knelt over a fallen Northman, a young recruit from White Harbor, his eyes vacant. This was the reality of war. Each step closer to the throne was stained with blood. Yet the men felt a surge of confidence. They had repelled the city's defenders once. Morale rose in the camps, albeit tinged with sorrow for the fallen. Night fell, and the cries of the wounded echoed in the darkness. Priests and maesters did what they could. Robb visited the wounded, thanking them for their service, bringing them words of hope. Stannis remained in his tent, planning the next move with his captains. Ned walked the perimeter, hearing snatches of conversation. Rumors that Tywin Lannister was rumored to be on the march at last. Others claimed Tywin would never arrive in time, that the city would fall. More chilling were whispers of shadowy shapes glimpsed beyond the lines, but Ned dismissed such talk as soldiers' superstitions, though part of him remembered how unnatural forces were stirring beyond the wall. Still, that was a separate battle, one that could only be fought when the realm was united. On the 7th day of the siege, the weather cleared, revealing the red walls of the keep in stark detail. Siege engines drew closer. Under the cover of night, the Baratheon men had advanced catapults and trebuchets to within striking range, hidden behind tall wooden screens. At dawn, the city woke to the dull thump of stones hurled at the battlements. Most crashed harmlessly into the walls, though a few found purchase, shaking parapets and sending bits of masonry tumbling. In response, the city's archers and scorpions returned fire. Arrows rained down on the attackers, and pots of burning pitch splattered across the field. One catapult was lost to flame, the crew forced to flee. But the combined forces had more. Another engine rumbled forward under thick hide covers, launching boulders that slammed into the walls. Stannis's plan was not to demolish the city's defenses completely, an impossible task with his limited resources, but to create breaches or weaken sections so that a storming party might succeed if it came to that. That evening, as Ned shared a meager supper of salt beef and stale bread with Robb, word arrived that a portion of the city's eastern wall had developed a deep crack. The Vale Knights had hammered it relentlessly with their stones. A breach might be formed soon. Robb looked uneasy. If we break the walls, the men will surge in. How do we keep this from becoming a slaughter, or another sack like the one under Tywin Lannister years ago? Ned set his bowl aside, exhaling slowly. We plan. We ensure the men understand that the city is to be taken without needless butchery. Stannis must set an example. If Joffrey or Cersei falls into our hands, let them stand trial. We must be better than Tywin's men were. Robb's gaze flicked across the dim lamplight to the shape of gray wind curled at the tent's entrance. Sacking the city would break us as well, father. The realm would never forgive it. Ned nodded. Aye, we must remember who we are, no matter how grim war becomes. He prayed the men would heed that call. By the 9th day, the catapults had battered a sizable section of the eastern wall. Lord Royce believed a single determined assault might break through, but it would be costly. Meanwhile, Stannis' scouts reported that Tywin's main force was still in the Riverlands, pinned by the Tullus, though rumors suggested that a smaller Lannister host led by the Kingslayer, Jaime Lannister, was attempting a forced march to relieve the city. Robb's face hardened at the mention of Jaime. The Kingslayer had once been his captive. Now Jaime roamed free again, a dangerous foe. On the 10th day, Stannis gave the order for a final demand to be delivered. A messenger carrying the stag sigil rode to the gate, shouting that if the city surrendered, the rightful king would spare the population. In response, a volley of arrows forced the messenger to retreat, one arrow striking his shoulder. That was answer enough. The horns sounded through the siege camps, men donning helms and lifting shields. The final assault was at hand. From Ned's vantage point atop a small rise, the battlefield stretched before him. Ranks of spearmen with the Baratheon banner advanced toward the battered eastern walls. Ladders and siege towers rumbled forward under a rain of arrows. Drums thundered, horns blared, and the cries of men seemed to shake the very ground. Ned's own Northmen moved up the center, while the Vale Knights circled to another gate, hoping to draw defenders away. In the distance, the battered catapults hurled stones into the crumbling section of wall, sending dust plumes into the sky. Robb led a contingent of cavalry, holding them in reserve. Gray wind kept pace, snarling at the confusion. Stannis, wearing black and gold armor, rode among his foot soldiers, urging them forward with stern commands. The city's defenders poured arrows and pitch from the walls. The clang of steel and the screams of the dying filled the air. In the Red Keep, Ned could imagine Cersei and Joffrey huddled, or perhaps plotting some last, desperate measure. A thunderous crash echoed from the eastern side. Part of the weakened wall collapsed, leaving a ragged gap. With a roar, Baratheon and Stark men surged forward. The defenders fought fiercely, but the breach was chaotic, and momentum favored the attackers. Ned heard the horns from the Vale Knights to the north, signifying another push. The city's outer perimeter was becoming untenable. Then came the wildfire. A noxious green explosion erupted near the gatehouse, blasting stone and men alike in a brilliant emerald flame. For an instant, it was as though the gates themselves had become dragon's breath. The boom rattled Ned's teeth. Men screamed, bodies wreathed in green fire, stumbling across the battlefield. The stench of burning flesh and chemicals churned the stomach. Even from where he stood, Ned felt the searing heat. Robb shouted orders, trying to keep the men from panicking. Another bloom of wildfire detonated near the collapsed wall, devastating a wave of attackers. The siege lines wavered. Stannis, unyielding, ordered men to bring up barrels of sand and water to douse the flames, to keep advancing. Archers loosed volleys at the parapets, trying to buy time. Through the swirling chaos, Ned glimpsed a figure in black armor riding among the defenders on the wall, brandishing a golden sword. The Hound, perhaps, or the Kingslayer himself. He could not see clearly. As more men pressed the breach, the city's defenders began to break. The walls were compromised, the ground below them soaked in blood and scattered with rubble. A group of Northmen managed to dash through the gap, pushing aside half-burned beams, and now a wedge of them forced their way inside. A banner of the crowned stag followed soon after. Another blast of wildfire erupted inside the walls, but it was too late to seal the breach. The city's defense was cracking from within. Ned found himself riding forward, heart pounding, directing men toward the newly opened path. The chaos was overwhelming: bodies, flames, and the roar of battle. Every second threatened new terrors. He glimpsed Robb leading the cavalry around the perimeter, trying to exploit a second entrance. Then a wave of gold cloaks poured out to meet them, only to be hammered by the Vale Knights, Yohn Royce at their head. Lances splintered, swords flashed. Shouts and screams mingled with the crashing of steel. Suddenly, the main gate shuddered. Trebuchets had pounded it for days, and now Stannis's men brought a massive ram. Under a canopy of wet hides to mitigate fire, they slammed the gates repeatedly. The thick oak beams groaned, cracked. Ned reined in near the ram, calling for archers to watch the walls above, where defenders hurled stones. Another flaming pot fell, scorching the canopy, but the men inside pushed onward. With a final, resounding crack, the gate gave way, splintered from top to bottom. Stannis's bannermen howled a fierce cry and surged forward into the city. Within, the streets devolved into pandemonium. Gold cloaks fought desperately, some throwing down their arms to surrender, others fighting to the death. Northmen, Stormlanders, and Vale Knights flooded the narrow alleys. Civilians shrieked, fleeing deeper into the city. Bells tolled from the Great September, their mournful clang echoing off the stone. Smoke rose in columns where pockets of wildfire or other fires burned out of control. Ned urged his horse forward with caution, sickened at the possibility of mindless slaughter. He shouted at any man wearing the Stark sigil to spare the innocent, to keep discipline. But in the frenzy of battle, not all men listened. Word spread that Lannister men were attempting to regroup near the Red Keep. That was the heart of their power. The great fortress perched on its hill, tinted red by the setting sun that burned through the thinning clouds. If the defenders could rally there, a final stand might be made. But Stannis, now inside the city with a considerable force, showed no intention of relenting. Robb fought through the twisting streets, heading uphill. Vale Knights galloped from corner to corner, clearing pockets of resistance. The final blow would be delivered at the Red Keep gates. Ned was among those who ascended the winding roads. Bodies lay strewn on the cobblestones, blood running in streams. The stench was overpowering. Civilians crouched behind barricaded doors, eyes wide with terror. A mother cradled a wailing child, sobbing as the tide of soldiers passed. Ned thought of Sansa and Arya, of how they'd once roamed these streets. The memory spurred him on. This city needed saving from the Lannisters and from itself. At the Red Keep's massive gatehouse, the drawbridge was raised, and a moat ringed the fortress walls. Archers perched on the ramparts. But with the rest of the city fallen, it was only a matter of time. Stannis's men brought up the captured catapults, though they would do little good against the keep's high walls. Robb's cavalry ringed the outer perimeter, preventing any attempt at sallying forth. Lord Royce and the Vale Knights guarded the approach from the river gate. The stage was set for the final confrontation. A sudden hush seemed to settle as Ned, Stannis, Robb, and a group of banners advanced to the edge of the moat. Shouts and cries echoed behind them, but this small area felt suspended in time. The defenders on the ramparts glared down, crossbows at the ready. Stannis stepped forward, voice echoing. "Surrender! Your cause is lost. Open these gates. Deliver Joffrey Baratheon and Cersei Lannister to us, and no further blood need be spilled." A figure on the ramparts answered, though from this distance Ned could not quite see who it was. The voice was high, imperious. "You come to depose the rightful king, yet your men butcher innocents in the streets. We will never yield to traitors. The Lannisters do not fear you." Robb's anger flared. "There is no rightful king in there, only a bastard of incest. Open the gates and let us end this, or we'll tear this keep stone from stone." The defenders hesitated. Then a flurry of crossbow bolts whirred downward. One man next to Ned took a bolt in the throat, toppling. That answered that. Stannis's men rushed forward with ladders and grapnels, hooking them to the walls. Boiling oil rained down, but the attackers pressed on. Flaming arrows streaked the sky. Ned guided men to cover behind pavises while sappers moved to undermine the walls from a hidden angle. The final storming of the Red Keep began in earnest. Though the keep was strong, the defenders were hopelessly outnumbered. Hour by hour, the attackers gained ground, scaling walls or forcing postern doors. The courtyard became a battlefield of swirling melee. Ned caught glimpses of men in lion-crested helms locked in savage combat with Northmen brandishing direwolf shields. Vale Knights on horseback thundered across the yard once the gates were forced. Robb was in the thick of it, gray wind tearing down foes with terrifying speed. Stannis fought with grim efficiency, his sword swinging in brutal arcs. At last, Ned found himself inside the keep's inner corridors. The grand halls of House Targaryen turned into Lannister domain. Marble floors were slick with blood. Tapestries burned. Servants cowered or fled. Step by step, the attackers advanced toward the throne room. A squad of gold cloaks mounted a desperate last stand, but broke after a fierce clash that left the floor littered with corpses. Ned forced himself not to retch at the carnage, his every sense overwhelmed. This was war, and wars ended in scenes like this. When the massive doors to the throne room were shoved open, the flicker of torchlight revealed the Iron Throne perched at the far end. There, cowering behind a line of Lannister guards and Kingsguard knights, was Joffrey Baratheon himself, clad in golden mail far too large for his slight frame. His face was white with terror, yet twisted with fury. Next to him stood Cersei Lannister, green eyes flashing with desperation, her golden hair disheveled. Also present were a few courtiers, Pycelle among them, quaking in fear. The Hound was there, sword in hand, stance uncertain. He seemed torn between protecting the Boy King and turning away. Stannis strode in, face set like iron, followed by Ned, Robb, and a press of armed men. The Lannister guards shifted uneasily. They were outnumbered. Some had bloodied swords, evidence of the last stand. One Kingsguard knight in white armor glared defiantly. Ser Meryn Trant, perhaps, or Ser Boros Blunt. The banners behind the attackers filled the throne room. The crowned stag, the direwolf, the falcon of the Vale. The difference in power was S. For a tense moment, neither side moved. Then Joffrey shrieked, "Kill them! Kill them all! I am the king! I command you!" His voice cracked with hysteria. None of the Lannister guards advanced. The Kingsguard looked at one another. Then, one by one, they dropped their swords. Even the Hound slowly backed away, face contorted with disgust. Joffrey screamed in outrage, stumbling back toward the throne. Cersei grabbed his arm, eyes darting frantically. Ned spoke, his voice echoing across the chamber. "Joffrey Baratheon, you are no true heir to Robert. You stand accused of treason, incest, and murder. Surrender now." He dared to glance at Cersei, thinking how once he had confronted her with the truth, hoping to avoid bloodshed. She had refused, plunging them all into darkness. Joffrey's eyes blazed, his face twisted in a mask of terror and rage. "I am the king," he screeched, voice shrill. "You can't." But his words were cut off as Stannis raised a hand, and a group of Stormland knights surged forward, disarming the last few guards. Cersei tried to cling to Joffrey, but they were pulled apart by mailed hands. The mother and son struggled, screaming curses and threats. At last, they were subdued, forced to their knees before the Iron Throne. Silence fell across the hall, broken only by ragged breathing and the crackle of distant flames. Robb stood near Ned, his sword still in hand, gray wind panting at his side. Lord Yohn Royce and other Vale knights ringed the hall, ensuring no escape. Outside, the city still burned in places, but the fighting was largely done. The Lannister regime had fallen. Stannis advanced up the steps toward the Iron Throne, looking down at the twisted metal seat. It glimmered with the faint reflection of flames. Slowly, he turned and gazed at the kneeling Joffrey and Cersei. "The false king is deposed," he said, voice resonant. "By rights of blood and law, I am Stannis of House Baratheon, first of my name, king of the Undulls and the First Men. Joffrey Baratheon is no more than a pretender. Guards secure them both. They will face trial for their crimes." Cersei spat in fury, but her eyes showed true fear. Joffrey fought like a cornered rat, shrieking and kicking. The knights dragged them away. Pycelle crept forward, hands shaking, babbling about loyalty and old age. Stannis motioned him aside, dismissing him. Then, in the hush that followed, Stannis slowly sat upon the Iron Throne. Its barbs and blades cradled him in cold steel. He clenched the armrests, as though testing the seat's reality. Ned stood to one side, Robb to the other. The Knights of the Vale, the Northmen, the Stormlanders. Together they bore witness to this moment. Some knelt, some stood uncertain. Robb's expression was guarded. He was king in the north, by the acclamation of his bannermen. Stannis was king on the Iron Throne by right of law. Their alliance had brought them here, but the future was still unsettled. For that brief moment, though, the war paused. The Lannisters had been cast down. The city had fallen. Stannis surveyed the throne room. "The war is not finished," he said, voice steady. "Tywin Lannister must be dealt with. The realm must be made whole again. But for this day we have victory." He looked to Ned, then to Robb, his gaze unwavering. "The North and the Vale have shed blood to see justice done. That debt will be honored." A wave of relief coursed through Ned. The city was theirs, though at terrible cost. He prayed the realm could find some measure of peace in the aftermath. Yet he knew winter still loomed, and the threats from beyond the wall still stirred. He also knew that the question of the North's status, whether it remained a separate kingdom under Robb or bent the knee to Stannis, would inevitably rise. But for now, they had achieved what so many thought impossible. Ned Stark, Stannis Baratheon, and Robb Stark, along with the Knights of the Vale, had marched on King's Landing and toppled the false king. The realm stood at a crossroads. Perhaps from this day onward, the Seven Kingdoms would begin to heal, or perhaps new strife would ignite. Yet in that uncertain moment, Ned allowed himself a single breath of hope. They had come this far, through exile, desertion, heartbreak, and war, to unseat a lion from his stolen throne. Whatever came next, they would face it as best they could. Stark, Baratheon, Aeron, all determined to preserve the realm from the darkest nights still to come. In the echoing stillness of the throne room, after the ferocious battle that had raged through the corridors of King's Landing, a new tension settled upon those who remained. Joffrey Baratheon and Cersei Lannister had been wrested away, sullen and furious, shrieking curses over their shoulders. Smoke wafted through the shattered windows, carrying the stench of war and ruin. Outside, cries of victory mingled with the sobs of the wounded, and the streets rang with the clamor of men sifting through the wreckage. Stannis Baratheon sat upon the Iron Throne, its cruel edges and twisted swords a stark reminder of Aegon's conquests. The newly anointed king maintained his usual grim composure, though he gazed out upon the hall as if to measure its every corner. Many men within earshot bent the knee, chanting his name, "Long live the king," though others lingered, uncertain of their place in this new order. Ned Stark stood off to the side, breathing heavily from the chaos of the last hour. His armor was spattered with dust, mud, and the blood of men he wished he'd never needed to fight. Robb Stark, likewise worn and grim, remained nearby, gray wind panting at his feet. The Great Jon, Rickard Karstark, and other northern lords gathered around Robb, each glancing toward Stannis with guarded expressions. King in the north, one half of them seemed to murmur inwardly, while the other half recognized that for better or worse, they had helped place Stannis on the Iron Throne. Lord Yohn Royce and the Knights of the Vale ringed the outskirts of the throne room, their steel glinting whenever torchlight caught the runes etched into their armor. Within the space of those tall walls, the hush was oppressive. Stannis's deep-set eyes flicked to Ned. "We have the city," he said. "My men will see order restored, as much as can be managed for now. But the question of Joffrey and his mother remains." Ned inclined his head. He had no fondness for Cersei or her monstrous son, yet how they were dealt with would set the tone for the realm. "They ought to stand trial," he said quietly. "Let the realm see the evidence of their crimes. If we simply execute them without judgment, we risk turning them into martyrs in the eyes of those still loyal to the Lannisters." Stannis's lips pursed. "I will render justice, but justice must not be delayed over long. Will not permit them the chance to escape or to sow chaos within the city. If you will serve as hand once more, Lord Stark, we can orchestrate a proper trial." At those words, a murmur rippled among the men. Robb's eyes flicked briefly to his father, and Ned felt a twinge in his chest. He remembered the last time he had accepted that position, how it had ended in betrayal, imprisonment, and near execution. "I would serve if it helps end the bloodshed," he replied cautiously. "But we must secure the city. We cannot hold a trial while the streets burn." Stannis nodded curtly, stood, and descended from the throne, the scraping of metal echoing. "Ser Davos," he called, and the Onion Knight hurried over, face lined with both relief and lingering dread. "Organize patrols to put out any fires and keep looting to a minimum. I want the city under control within the day." Davos bowed. "Yes, Your Grace." At that, Stannis and his guards swept out, leaving Ned and Robb to gather themselves. Lords from both the North and the Vale warily surveyed one another, aware that this victory did not solve all the realm's troubles. The Lannisters were down but not yet destroyed. Tywin and Jaime Lannister still commanded forces in the field, and their reaction to the fall of King's Landing would likely be swift and brutal. But the city was in Stannis's grip, and for the moment that fact might shift the balance of power in the entire realm. When Ned and Robb exited the throne room, they were greeted by the scenes of war's aftermath. The corridors were filled with the reek of smoke and death. Bodies still lay in the halls, some in Lannister crimson, others in Baratheon gold or stark gray. Servants stumbled about, eyes hollow, trying to salvage what they could. In the distance, Ned heard a woman's keening wail. War spares no one, he thought. Outside, the day was gray and dim, as though the gods themselves mourned the city's fate. The heavy storm clouds above threatened more rain that would mingle with blood in the gutters. Soldiers hurried back and forth, some carrying water to douse pockets of flame, others dragging prisoners or stacking the dead. Robb scanned the scene with a grim set to his jaw. Gray wind padded beside him, hackles raised. They made their way through the castle complex, heading for the yard that overlooked the Blackwater Rush. There, Stannis's command had taken shape. Barricades of hastily stacked furniture were being disassembled by Baratheon soldiers. Archers patrolled the walls, their eyes scanning for any sign of Lannister loyalists trying to regroup. As Ned approached, he spotted Lord Yon Royce already giving orders to Vale Knights to secure the gates leading into the city proper. Robb muttered, "The men will want to know our next move. We've captured the city, but the Northmen must see if our cause ends here." Ned cast him a sidelong glance. "Your cause, you mean?" he said gently, mindful that Robb had been declared king in the north. "I declared for Stannis because I believe him the rightful king, but your bannermen swore to you, not him. We need to see what alliances can be forged so that the realm stands united. We cannot have the North alone in a time like this, not when winter's near and Tywin Lannister's still free." Robb's face was caught between pride and duty. "I will not force my men to bend the knee to anyone if they do not wish it." He paused, studying the battered battlements. "But if Stannis proves honorable, if he keeps his word, if he respects the North's autonomy, perhaps we can work together. I have no desire to continue a war that will only drain us all." Ned placed a hand on Robb's shoulder. "We will find a way," he said, hoping the words held more truth than mere comfort. They parted ways briefly, Ned to confer with Ser Davos and a handful of other Baratheon commanders about stabilizing the city, Robb to rally his Northmen. The Great John, Rickard Karstark, and others would want to know the lay of the land, especially how they might be housed in King's Landing or in the surrounding countryside. Winterfell was far away. It dawned on Ned that in the confusion of the campaign, he had heard no fresh word from home. His younger children were presumably safe under Maester Luwin's watch, but the Ironborn might still pose a threat in the north, or any number of other troubles might have arisen. Still, he had to attend to the pressing matter. King's Landing must not be allowed to descend into anarchy. He found Ser Davos Seaworth near the remnants of the main gate, conferring with a group of Stormlanders. Davos's face lit up with relief at seeing Ned. "Lord Stark," he said warmly, "if you've a moment, there's trouble near Flea Bottom. Reports are that some Sellswords took advantage of the chaos to start looting. We need soldiers with the name Stark or Baratheon to quell it before it spreads." Ned nodded. "We'll dispatch some men at once." He gestured to a pair of Northmen, who stiffened at attention. "Go with Ser Davos. Represent House Stark well. No needless bloodshed, but see to it that the people know we are here to restore order, not to pillage." They saluted, trotting after the Onion Knight, who gave Ned a quick, grateful smile. The man was humble but capable, and Ned silently thanked the gods that Stannis trusted him so deeply. Making his way deeper into the yard, Ned spotted a pair of Baratheon knights corralling a group of prisoners, some Lannister guards, a handful of gold cloaks, and a few rogues who had tried to sneak away with plunder. The prisoners huddled together in sullen silence, fear evident in their eyes. Ned told the knights to hold them in the dungeons until the city could be made safe enough to conduct inquiries or trials. It felt strange, giving such orders in King's Landing again, as though he were still Hand of the King under Robert's reign. But Robert was gone, and Ned had no illusions that Stannis' rule would be any kinder. The man was just perhaps but seldom merciful. By the time Ned climbed the steps back into the Red Keep, darkness was creeping in. The torches lit the halls in flickering orange, revealing more devastation left by the siege. Shattered windows, crumbled masonry, black scorch marks from thrown pots of oil. Northmen, Vale Knights, and Baratheon soldiers stood in uneasy clusters, each group trying to navigate how they fit together under this tenuous alliance. If any Lannister loyalists still roamed the keep, they dared not show themselves. Eventually, Ned found his way to a spacious solar near Maegor's Holdfast, where he had word Stannis was gathering his principal lords. He arrived to find Robb already there, along with Lord Yon Royce, the Great John, Rickard Karstark, and a collection of Stormland lords Bar Emmon, Penrose, Estermont, and a few lesser-known bannermen wearing the crowned stag. Stannis himself stood at the head of a table, arms folded behind his back. The remains of a meager meal, bread, salted fish, watered wine, were scattered on a sideboard. It struck Ned that many present likely hadn't eaten a real meal in days. Stannis wasted no time. "We have the capital," he said, "but Tywin Lannister remains in the west. My scouts say he's pinned near Harrenhal or close to it, fighting Tully and Stark forces." I intend to send reinforcements at once to secure the victory. The Great John rumbled. Aye, we can smash Tywin if we corner him. Let him see how our steel tastes. A few men grunted in agreement, but Robb raised a hand. We should proceed with caution. Tywin is a canny commander. If we march hastily, he may slip away or lure us into a trap. Robb's gaze flicked to Ned. We may need to hold some men here as well. The city's not stable. Stannis nodded, though his jaw tightened. I have enough men to spare for both tasks. The city is mine. The fleet controls the harbor. Tywin's best recourse is to regroup or attempt to retake King's Landing by force. We cannot give him that opportunity. Ned spoke quietly, the memory of Tywin's cunning fresh in his mind. If we can keep him bottled up in the Riverlands, we should do so. Cut off his supply lines, starve his host. Harrenhal's a massive fortress, but it's cursed, and Tywin can't hold out forever if the Tullus are pressing him from one side, and we from another. Stannis gave him a curt nod that served as thanks. Then he glanced across the room. Lord Royce, you and your knights have proven valuable in the field. Will you march west to reinforce the Tully lines? Lord Royce inclined his head. We can, your grace, though I beg a small number of my knights remain in the city to ensure the Vale's interests are not forgotten. Stannis waved a dismissive hand. Very well. I care not, so long as we have enough men to finish Tywin. What matters is that the realm sees the Lannisters defeated and the rightful king enthroned. At that, the assembled lords gave murmurs of assent. The Great John was grinning widely, picturing another glorious battle. Some of the Stormland lords seemed anxious, less eager than Stannis for more bloodletting, but aware that the war was not truly over. Cersei and Joffrey might stand trial, but Tywin and Jaime remained free. I'll ride west myself if need be, Stannis declared, his eyes flicking back to Ned. But first we must secure the city. The men grow restless, and we do not want another sack of King's Landing. House Baratheon will not be remembered as a butcher of innocents. Quiet agreement followed. A part of Ned wanted to suggest that Stannis should remain in King's Landing to establish order, to show the realm a steady hand. But he knew Stannis's nature. The man would want to personally direct the finishing blow. If he entrusted the city's governance to Ned, that might place Ned again in the position of hand. And that was a dangerous place for any man, especially one who'd already suffered the city's betrayals once. But Ned had come this far, spurred by duty. If that meant staying in the capital, so be it. At least he could protect the realm from further horrors while Stannis warred against Tywin. They spoke late into the night, deciding upon the distribution of troops and supplies. Lord Royce would take a large contingent of Vale Knights west in 2 days' time. Robb agreed to send some northern foot as well, those who were less battered from the recent battles, while others stayed behind to recuperate. The Great John practically begged to lead a portion of the assault, but Robb held him back with the promise that his turn would come once more intelligence arrived from the Riverlands. Scribes recorded each decision by the dim glow of candles, lines of text that would shape the realm's near future. Finally, Stannis dismissed the gathering. The men filtered out in weary groups, exchanging hushed remarks. Robb lingered to speak to Ned. Outside the solar, the corridor was still heavy with smoke. Father, Robb said quietly, Stannis will chase Tywin to the ends of the realm if he must. What will we do in his absence? Ned looked at his son's young yet battle-worn face. We hold the city, we keep it from falling into chaos, and we ensure that justice is done. This is not an easy path, but it's what we must do. And he hesitated. We must remember the threat beyond the wall. Eventually, the realm needs to turn its eyes north. Robb nodded, recalling the uncertain rumors of whites and White Walkers. Few southern lords believed such tales, but Ned had no doubts. The longer the realm was mired in petty wars, the less prepared it would be for the real battle. The next few days passed in a swirl of reorganizing King's Landing. Forced to face the damage they'd inflicted, Stannis's men worked double shifts to clear rubble, extinguish lingering fires, and restore a semblance of order. Lords from the Vale and the north took turns patrolling the streets, halting the worst of the looting and violence. Prisoners were hauled to the dungeons in droves. Gold cloaks who had resisted, looters, cutthroats, and the occasional Lannister retainer who'd been found trying to flee with chests of gold. Cersei and Joffrey remained in custody in the Red Keep's highest tower, closely guarded. Stannis prohibited any visitors aside from a few trusted men who brought them water and plain fare. Rumor said that Joffrey spent his days screaming for release, threatening all manner of torture against those who had imprisoned him. Cersei, said the guards, was quieter, but her eyes burned with hatred. In the throne room, a few of the tapestries were replaced, though bloodstains still marred the marble floor. Stannis convened a public hearing on the third day to announce to the city that Joffrey Baratheon was no true heir, that House Lannister had deceived the realm, and that he, Stannis, claimed the throne by right of blood. His voice rang cold across the battered hall, and many of the city's remaining inhabitants, frightened and uncertain, bowed their heads in submission. A handful might have wanted Tommen or Myrcella raised to the throne, but both children had vanished from the city days before the siege, spirited away by loyal Lannister servants, or so rumor claimed, that left only Joffrey and Cersei, soon to be tried for treason. Most small folk were too weary and hungry to muster loud objections. They had new masters now, and those masters fed them barley bread from the city granaries. Ned's days were filled with incessant duties. Delegations from lords who'd arrived too late for the fighting but wanted to swear fealty, scribes who demanded his signature on warrants and orders for supplies, wounded men who required decent bedding in the Great Hall rather than being left to rot in the streets. More than once, he found himself haunted by the memory of his own imprisonment in these walls, the moment he'd thought he would lose his head before a baying crowd. So much was the same, yet so much had changed. Meanwhile, Robb tried to keep the Northmen together. Some were restless, missing their families. Others were embittered that they might have to kneel to Stannis. Yet most recognized that forging a stable peace was paramount. The city guards slowly took shape, a mixture of Baratheon men, Vale Knights, and a contingent of Northmen who wore a distinctive cloak in stark gray. The gold cloaks who'd survived and submitted were being reorganized under Stannis's officers. Some might remain in service, while others would be discharged or punished for their crimes. Then came the day of Cersei and Joffrey's preliminary hearing, intended as a precursor to a full trial. The throne room was crowded with courtiers, knights, scribes, and a throng of small folk who had been allowed in to see justice done. A dais had been erected near the base of the Iron Throne, upon which sat Stannis in black and gold regalia. At his side stood Ser Davos Seaworth and, slightly behind, Ned Stark, who had cautiously resumed many of the duties of the King's Hand at Stannis's insistence. On the other side stood a number of Stormland lords, Vale Knights, and Northern Bannermen. Robb was present too, wearing a simple crown of bronze and iron hammered together in the north, though he left the official proceedings to his father and to Stannis. Cersei was led in first, manacled at the wrists, though still possessed of a haughty bearing. Her green eyes swept the hall with disdain, lips pressed together. Joffrey followed, flanked by guards. He still wore fine velvet, though it was ripped and stained. Fear flickered in his eyes, but he wore a sneer, chin held high in a desperate attempt at bravado. When the crowd beheld him, a wave of whispers arose. This was the boy who'd terrorized the city, who had forced them to watch the execution of innocents. Now his power was dust. Stannis stood. The accused stand before the crown, he intoned in a voice that carried to every corner of the chamber. Joffrey Baratheon, known as Joffrey of House Lannister, is charged with treason, murder, and falsely claiming the throne. Cersei Lannister is charged with treason, conspiracy, and abetting the false claim. Cersei's eyes flashed. "You have no proof," she snarled, though her voice trembled. "You force me here by might of arms, but that does not make you king." Stannis's lips thinned. "You will have your trial. Witnesses will speak. Documents will be presented, documents signed by your father, King Robert Baratheon, naming me as heir in the event of his death, and the records from the Book of Lineages demonstrating that your children's parentage does not match the Baratheon line." He gestured to a scribe at the table. "The realm will see the truth." Joffrey let out a shrill laugh, though it rang hollow. You think a few scraps of parchment will matter? I was crowned in front of the great September of Baelor. I am the king. You, he glared at Ned. You traitor, you knelt to me once. I should have had your head back then. The crowd stirred at his words, murmuring in hushed voices. Ned, for his part, kept his composure, though the memories of that day under the scorching sun of King's Landing still cut him deeply. I knelt to save my daughters, Ned replied evenly. I would have done far worse if it meant sparing them from your cruelty. The mention of Sansa and Arya twisted his heart with fresh worry. He had not heard anything of Arya since escaping King's Landing, while Sansa had been at the Lannisters' mercy. He prayed that once the city was. Stannis raised his hand to restore order. These are preliminary charges. The formal trial shall occur in 1 fortnight, giving time for key witnesses to arrive and for the city to find a measure of calm. Until then, the prisoners will be confined to the Red Keep under guard. Should they attempt escape, they forfeit their right to a trial. Cersei's mouth twisted. You are a fool, she hissed. My father will come. When he does, he'll tear you all to pieces. Stannis gave a short, mirthless laugh. Your father is pinned in the Riverlands, and if he comes here, we will meet him on the field. Guards, take them away. So ended the hearing, and the watchers dispersed in uneasy knots of conversation. The city had never witnessed such a spectacle. Some muttered that a fortnight's wait was generous. Others grumbled that Stannis was no better than his brother Robert if he would keep them alive at all. Ned knew it was the right course. A public trial could strengthen Stannis's legitimacy and reveal the truth. Nevertheless, each day they waited gave Tywin time to act. That evening, Ned returned to the quarters Stannis had given him. It was a modest suite in the Red Keep, with a single window overlooking the gardens. A threadbare tapestry of stags in a forest hung on one wall, and a small desk was piled high with scrolls. Robb joined him there, along with the great Jon Rickard Karstark and a few key northern lords. The young king in the north sank into a chair, eyes heavy with fatigue. Gray wind sprawled at his feet, muzzle resting on massive paws. We have men in the city, in the castle, Robb began, voice taut, and some rest in the camps outside the walls. We should regroup soon, father. Many of the northern soldiers want to return to the Neck or beyond. Our fields need harvesters, and winter is coming. Ned breathed out slowly. I do not want to keep them from their homes, but the realm is still in danger. Tywin, I know. Robb ran a hand through his hair. The Lannisters have always been a threat, but we can't keep thousands of Northmen here idling. If Stannis means to crush Tywin, let him. We've done our part. My men yearn for home, and I won't deny them indefinitely. Karstark frowned. Your Grace, the Lannisters burned my sons. I want Tywin's head on a spike. And you shall have your vengeance, Robb said. But is it not enough that the North fought bravely and helped take King's Landing? Are we to bleed ourselves dry for Stannis? Ned understood Robb's frustration. The North had already paid a steep price. Yet if they withdrew entirely, it might tip the balance in the West. Tywin's armies could regroup, leading to fresh war. Moreover, Ned felt a personal responsibility to see the Lannisters brought to justice. Cersei had orchestrated so many evils. But was that a reason to hold the North hostage far from home? At length, Ned spoke. Perhaps a compromise. Robb, you can send the bulk of the Northmen home, while keeping a smaller contingent here to support King Stannis. Once the trial is concluded, we can assess the situation with Tywin. If it seems the fighting is nearing an end, you can recall even those men. Meanwhile, we ensure the realm does not see the North as turning its back on the war. He glanced at the great Jon and Karstark. Your houses can decide how best to allocate your men. Karstark was silent for a moment, then gave a curt nod. If that is our king's will. Robb's shoulders eased slightly. It seems fair. We did not crown ourselves merely to be used. We have our own land to protect. I will remain a while longer, father, if only to see how this trial unfolds. But once the matter is resolved, the North has no quarrel with the throne, provided it respects us. Ned knew the subtext. The question of whether the North would remain an independent kingdom or rejoin the realm under Stannis still hung unanswered. Stannis had not pressed the point, perhaps fearing to alienate one of his greatest allies. But that confrontation was sure to come. For now, Ned merely nodded. We must hope for peace. The realm cannot endure more strife. They parted ways, each man weighed by his own burdens. Ned found himself alone in the solar, the night pressing at the windows. He sat heavily at the desk, rifling through the scrolls that demanded his attention. Requisitions for grain to feed the city, orders for mending the city walls, lists of the dead, requests from merchants. So much needed doing, and he was but one man. He longed for a letter from Winterfell, from Maester Luwin, or even from Bran or Rickon, but none had come. The ravens had been scattered by war. Eventually, a soft knock roused him from his thoughts. The door opened to reveal a young squire carrying a flickering lantern. "Lord Stark," the boy said, voice quavering. "There's a lady here to see you. Says she's from the north." The boy shifted on his feet. "She wouldn't give her name, but she says it's urgent." Ned's heart quickened. "Show her in." Moments later, a cloaked figure slipped into the solar, lantern light dancing on the walls. Ned rose, hand instinctively drifting to the hilt of his sword, though he did not draw it. The figure pushed back her hood, revealing a narrow face, dark hair pulled back in a braid, and eyes filled with cautious resolve. Ned did not know her at once, but by her bearing, she looked like someone used to traveling rough roads. "Lord Stark," she began quietly, "I beg pardon for coming so late. I'm from the Last Hearth, one of the Umber's holdfasts. We traveled with the Northern Army for a time, then broke off. I've news." Ned gestured for her to sit, noticing how her hands trembled. He poured a cup of watered wine and offered it to her. "Please, what is it?" She swallowed, glancing around as though fearing eavesdroppers. "We've had rumors from the far north, beyond the wall. Rangers of the Night's Watch have come south with warnings. They say the dead are rising, White Walkers, that a white slew men near the fist of the first men. That Commander Mormont is calling for every able man." Ned's stomach twisted. The rumors he had feared. War with the Lannisters had overshadowed the real threat. Commander Mormont. So he lives? She nodded. "Aye, but he and his men are beset by raids from whites and worse. They sent word to Eastwatch, to Shadow Tower. The wildlings are stirring as well. There's talk of a man named Mance Rayder raising an army beyond the wall." Ned rubbed a hand across his brow. 1,000 implications sprang to mind. The realm was so embroiled in civil war that few gave credence to the stories of White Walkers. And yet here was more confirmation that the old nightmares were real. If Mance Rayder led the wildlings in force, the Watch would be overwhelmed without help. "This news must reach King Stannis," Ned said. "And my son Robb. We must—" He paused, recalling his own breach of vows to the Watch. He was, in their eyes, a deserter, but that would not stop him from helping them now. "We must do something. If the threat is as grave as you say, it's beyond any one house's power to stop." She lowered her gaze. "I only know the Umbers are frightened. They say the nights grow colder, the dire wolves howling on the wind. If the dead truly walk—" Ned gripped her hand gently. "You did right to bring me this news. Remain in the city for a time. I'll see to your lodging and see that you're safe." He paused. "Have you told anyone else?" She shook her head. "I feared they'd laugh at me, or worse." He nodded. "Stay here. I'll speak to King Stannis." After she left, Ned sank onto the bench, heart pounding. So it begins, he thought. The war for the Iron Throne might be all but decided, but the war for the realm's survival was only just dawning. He knew Stannis's nature, stubborn, proud, but also devout in his sense of duty. If Ned could convince him that the real threat loomed in the north, perhaps the new king would rally troops to defend the wall. But how would the realm react to yet another call to arms? He rose, setting aside the papers on his desk, no longer able to focus on petty matters of grain and reparations. The matter of the White Walkers dwarfed them all. He left the solar, striding through the halls in search of Stannis or Ser Davos. Time was slipping away, and winter drew closer with every passing day. The city might be quiet now, but darkness pressed in from the edges of the world. At length, Ned found Ser Davos near the castle gates, where he was directing a small group of men to reinforce security. The Onion Knight looked surprised to see Ned at this hour, but quickly turned from his duties. "Lord Stark? You seem troubled." Ned nodded. "I have reason. I need to speak with King Stannis at once. Urgent news from the north." Davos's expression hardened. "He is in council with his lords, but I will take you to him." They climbed the Red Keep's winding staircases until they reached a small war room lit by torches. Stannis stood behind a large table, scowling at a spread of maps. Robb was not present, nor were most of the other lords. Only a couple of Stormland officers hovered nearby, looking exhausted. Stannis glanced up, his gaze disapproving at the interruption, until he caught sight of Ned's face. "Lord Stark," he said, "you appear as if you've seen a ghost." "Perhaps I have," Ned replied, voice low. He bowed slightly out of reflex. "Your Grace, I have just received word that the threat beyond the wall is worse than we feared. The Night's Watch begs for aid. They say the dead walk." Silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of the torches. One of the officers snorted quietly. Stannis, however, frowned deeply. "I have heard these rumors before," he said. "Melisandre has spoken of a great darkness. My brother always laughed at such talk, but we are not Robert. Still, we are in the midst of a war. Tywin Lannister's forces remain in the field." Ned's eyes burned with urgency. "This threat dwarfs Tywin Lannister. If the others descend upon the realm, all your battles for the throne will have been for naught. The wall has stood for thousands of years, but it must be manned, and the wildlings mass under a king of their own, ready to break through." Stannis looked down at the map, hand curling into a fist. "The realm cannot fight on two fronts," he said slowly. "We have to finish Tywin quickly. Then perhaps we can turn north." "There may not be time," Ned warned. "We must at least send men or supplies to Castle Black to Eastwatch. The watch is dangerously undermanned. They need reinforcements from every corner of the Seven Kingdoms." Stannis was silent a long moment, considering. "I cannot tear my host apart," he said finally, "but I see the logic. Once the trial is concluded, and once Tywin is destroyed or forced to yield, I will call the banners to defend the realm. If it is truly as dire as you say, then I cannot ignore it." Ned swallowed, knowing that might be the best concession he would get from Stannis for now. "When the trial is done, if we are still waiting for Tywin to show his hand, perhaps Robb Stark and the North can march home. And from there, we can rally the Northern Lords to bolster the watch." He hesitated, then spoke from the heart. "Your Grace, I deserted the Night's Watch under duress. The vow was forced upon me, and yet I would do anything to save them now." Stannis's eyes flickered. "Your reasons for desertion matter little to me. These are dark times, and I need every man of honor to stand for the living. Tell the world what you have seen and heard. Rally them. The real war may be in the cold of the north, not in the warm south." Ned exhaled, an odd mixture of relief and dread filling him. He bowed his head. "Thank you, Your Grace." Stannis straightened, turning to the map of Westeros once again. His gloved finger traced northward, past Moat Cailin, toward the wall. He said nothing more, but a pensive hush fell over the room. Ned realized that at least Stannis was listening. That was more than Robert had done, and far more than Joffrey would have. If they could only end this business with Tywin swiftly, if they could only avoid further fracturing of the realm, if the Vale, the North, and the Stormlands could unite, perhaps there was a chance. He left Stannis to his council, stepping into the corridor where Ser Davos awaited. The Onion Knight studied him. "Dark news indeed." "Aye," Ned agreed. "And if we fail all these battles, these crowns will mean nothing." Davos sighed, as if the weight of the world sat on his narrow shoulders. "I do not doubt it. We men of the narrow sea are taught to respect the storms. If a greater storm is coming, we had best be ready." Ned offered him a wan smile of gratitude, then departed. Outside, the night had deepened. The Red Keep's windows showed only flickers of distant lanterns among the city streets below. As he walked, the wind carried a slight chill, unusual for a southern climate. Perhaps it was his imagination, or perhaps it was truly a sign that winter's breath was creeping inexorably over the land. In the courtyard, Robb Stark was waiting, having just finished speaking with some of his bannermen. Gray Wind paced in the darkness, ears pricked. Robb turned as Ned approached. "Father, what is it?" Ned told him about the messenger's news, the White Walkers, the imminent threat. Robb's face hardened, and Gray Wind let out a low rumble, as though sensing the tension. "So it's come to that, then," Robb said quietly. "War in the north. A war we cannot ignore." "Yes," Ned said. "We must prepare. Gather as many men as we can spare and fortify the wall. We can only hope the realm responds once they see the truth." Robb stood tall, a young man who had seen far too many battlefields already. "Then we have no time to waste. We'll see this trial done. I'll let my bannermen return home as you suggested, but some will stay behind to keep King's Landing from falling into disarray. And after that, we march north, with or without the rest of the realm." Ned felt a surge of pride for his son, though it mingled with heartbreak for the burdens he carried. "It may come to that." He laid a hand on Robb's shoulder. "We must find a way to unify the realm, or we face destruction." Robb nodded, and for a long moment, father and son stood in the quiet courtyard, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. Beyond the battered walls of the Red Keep, King's Landing slumbered in uneasy reprieve, the stench of smoke still lingering in the air. And far beyond, across the war-torn fields and the twisting roads, the black silhouette of the north stretched to the horizon, the vast unknown beyond the wall calling to them like a distant drumbeat. They had seized the Iron Throne, toppled Joffrey, and for now stymied Lannister power. But neither crowns nor thrones would matter if the nightmares lurking beyond the edge of the world spilled south. There, in the hush of midnight, Ned Stark and Robb Stark understood that the greatest war of all was yet to be fought, and this time victory might not rest on steel and banners alone, but on the unity of a realm that had all too often chosen discord over solidarity. In the days ahead, trials and judgments would shape the fate of Cersei and Joffrey, while armies clashed in the west and winter's chill crept further south. Still, for that one moment, they stood together, father and son, a single hope binding them, that when the cold winds rose and the darkness advanced, the living might stand as one, men of the north, the Vale, the Stormlands, and beyond, determined not to let their petty differences consign them all to oblivion. And if that hope held firm, perhaps even the darkest winter could be defied by the unwavering courage of those who refused to bend before the storm. Ned Stark stood by the tall windows of the Tower of the Hand, gazing out at King's Landing as a slow dawn broke over the city. The horizon glowed with rose and orange, an almost serene scene for a city that had so recently been battered by siege. In the courtyard below, men were already on the move, northern guards, Baratheon soldiers, and Knights of the Vale conducting their daily patrols to keep order. The King's Landing that Ned recalled from his first arrival so many moons ago felt like a different world altogether. Now Stannis Baratheon held the Iron Throne, the Lannister Queen and her son were imprisoned, and the city was subdued, its future suspended in uneasy quiet. He turned from the window. His desk was piled high with parchments demanding decisions, requests from lords newly sworn to Stannis, pleas from frightened small folk, records of supplies for the city watch, and daily tallies of the hungry. Somewhere among them were reports regarding the trials, for all the city was abuzz about the fate of the Lannisters, locked high in the Red Keep. The day of that long-awaited trial was fast approaching, and every rumor possible had taken flight among the alleys of Flea Bottom. That Cersei would call upon dark sorcery, that Joffrey would be smuggled away by mercenaries, that Tywin would appear at the last moment with a massive army. Ned sank into the chair, noticing the rumble of discomfort in his shoulders. He had never truly wanted this life. He had not sought to be Hand of the King, nor to be the one who would orchestrate the downfall of an entire house. Yet here he was. Stannis had insisted that Ned continue in his role, not only to lend legitimacy to the new regime but also to guide it with the sense of honor that many believed Ned Stark carried. The realm trusted Stark more readily than they trusted a Baratheon known for severity. Stannis, for all his rigid righteousness, recognized that. So Ned, despite his misgivings, was once again Hand of the King. It was different from serving Robert, but not easier. A soft rap sounded on the door. Robb Stark entered, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a simple doublet bearing the direwolf sigil. His crown of the north was absent, a sign that he walked here more as a son than as the king in the north. Grey Wind, nearly the size of a small horse by now, padded at his side. The direwolf's eyes scanned the room warily, but he seemed to accept that no threat lurked here. "Father," Robb greeted, voice low. "The city stirs over the trial. Are we truly ready?" Stannis is impatient. Ned set down a scroll. Stannis's impatience is understandable. He wants to see this concluded so he can move against Tywin with a free hand, or else finalize an accord that ends the Lannister threat altogether. But the trial must be carried out with care. We'll have the realm's eyes upon us. A rushed or rigged judgment will only invite more discord. Stannis understands that. Enough, at least, to wait until the time is right. Robb exhaled. "Aye, the men are weary as well. Many of the Northmen who remain in King's Landing are only here because we fear a resurgence of violence if Tywin tries to retake the capital. I've dispatched the Great John and a portion of our forces back up the King's Road toward the Riverlands, where they might intercept any Lannister moves." He paused. "We all want this war ended." Ned nodded. The trial would be a theatrical affair, orchestrated both for justice and to solidify Stannis's rule. If the entire realm could see how Cersei and Joffrey had lied, how they had murdered, how they had used the throne as a personal tool for cruelty, perhaps other houses still wavering would fall in line. Truth had power, but it did not always move men's hearts. Gold and steel did that. Ned hoped this demonstration of justice would be enough to avoid further bloodshed. He reached for one of the parchments on the desk. Word came from Riverrun. Edmure Tully's scouts confirm Tywin's host is fractured, but still dangerous. We expect a response as soon as the trial's verdict is known. Robb's jaw set in a grim line. Then we must be ready. When is the trial? 2 days. 2 days. In the throne room, open to lords and small folk alike, though I expect the small folk will have limited space. The city can't hold them all, so there'll be chaos enough. Ned let out a slow breath. But we must show the realm that the Lannisters are not above the law. Robb inclined his head, resting a hand lightly on Grey Wind's back. "I'll see the men remain disciplined. I also heard rumor that some new arrival from Essos seeks an audience with you, Father. Did you hear of that?" Ned's brow arched. "Essos? No, I've had no time to see travelers. With the war, I'd assume trade was minimal, and many ships are under Stannis's control." "Who is it?" Robb shrugged. "Someone who arrived at the harbor yesterday, under the banner of a 3-headed dragon. She rides with an entourage of, well, foreigners. The rumor is that a Targaryen might walk the city once again. You recall that talk of Daenerys Targaryen, the last living child of the Mad King? The mention of that name sent a quiver through Ned's memory. He thought of the rebellion, of Robert's fury for House Targaryen, the dead children of Rhaegar. The notion that a Targaryen, grown into adulthood, might come back to Westeros at such a precarious time. "Daenerys," Ned murmured. "If she truly lives, and if she's come here now, that complicates matters. We must remain cautious. Stannis has no love for pretenders to the throne." Robb nodded. "But if she truly commands a great force, or something more, we can't ignore her. Word has it that she has dragons." "Dragons?" Ned echoed, recalling old tales. "Another rumor that I once dismissed as impossible. Yet we've both seen how improbable events can reshape the realm." He set the scroll aside, his mind turning. "I should speak to Stannis about this if it proves true. A Targaryen returning to King's Landing on the eve of a Lannister trial. The realm is a tinderbox. Robb gave a soft, humorless laugh. Isn't it always? Let's just pray we get through the next few days without more bloodshed. Ned squeezed his son's shoulder gently. We'll try. Together, they departed the Tower of the Hand, stepping into the corridor that led toward the royal apartments. They found King Stannis in a small council chamber, not the Grand Hall, reviewing a map with Ser Davos and a few lords from the Stormlands. Stannis's brows furrowed at Ned's approach. Lord Stark, Stannis said by way of greeting, voice stiff. There are matters we must finalize. The evidence for the trial stands ready. The High Septon has arrived to preside over its spiritual aspects. Every courtesy has been extended to the Lady Cersei and her son, though they deserve none. We'll have them marched in chains on the morrow to show their guilt. Ned tried to keep his tone neutral. We want to avoid spectacle that suggests the verdict is predetermined. The realm must see that justice is served, not vengeance. An open proceeding where the Lannisters can speak in their own defense, even if we suspect them to be less than truthful. Stannis's gaze flicked to Robb, then back to Ned. We will not let them twist this into a stage for their lies. If the boy tries to proclaim himself rightful king again, or if Cersei attempts to seduce half the court to her side, we must be ready. If they resist or attempt to escape, we'll put them to the sword. Ser Davos cleared his throat softly. Your Grace, I believe Lord Stark only suggests that we follow due process so the houses who waver see that we are fair. Fear might bend some to us, but fairness will keep them. Stannis gave a curt nod. Very well. Let them speak so long as we maintain order. Once the evidence is laid out, no one can deny the truth of their treason. Ned decided it best to broach the new rumor immediately. There is another matter, Your Grace, he said. We hear tell of a visitor from Essos, one bearing the banner of the three-headed dragon, supposedly a Targaryen. That caught Stannis's attention at once. He straightened, jaw tightening. A Targaryen? Here? Are the gods mocking us with yet another claimant to the throne? Likely so, Ned said. If it is Daenerys Targaryen, as rumor suggests, she would be the daughter of the Mad King. Robert believed her a threat long ago, but we never found her after she fled across the sea. It seems she has grown, garnered some measure of power. The small folk say she travels with dragons, though that may be an exaggeration. Stannis's face hardened. When I was at Dragonstone, certain letters spoke of a young Targaryen bride sold to a Dothraki call. It was rumored she died or vanished in the Red Waste. If she has survived, and if she truly commands dragons, that could change everything. Robb looked from one man to the other. Should we not at least grant her an audience? If she has come peacefully, we gain more by speaking to her first than by shutting her out. The Lannisters are on trial. Tywin is in the field, winter looms, and the realm is battered by war. Another conflict with a Targaryen may shatter us. Ser Davos nodded. A fair point, my lord. If we gain the Targaryen's support, or at least secure her neutrality, the realm might avoid further war. And if she truly has dragons, we would not want them turned against us. Stannis let out a short, humorless laugh. I am not a man who kneels, nor do I wish to see some foreign queen assume the throne after all this bloodshed. But I'm not blind to reason. I will not forbid her entry into the city. Let her come. Let her see that I am the rightful king. If she poses a threat, I will deal with her as I have with every other threat. With that, he turned back to the map, an air of finality in his stance. Ned exchanged a brief look with Robb. Stannis's grudging acceptance was all they could hope for. If Daenerys Targaryen truly arrived, the stage would be even more fraught than before, but perhaps it offered a glimmer of possibility. The realm needed unity, and maybe, just maybe, there was a path to it if old enmities could be laid to rest. They left Stannis to his war meeting, walking once again through the keep's corridors. Robb parted ways to speak to the Northern Bannermen, while Ned went to finalize the details for the trial with the castle's stewards and scribes. Everywhere he went, he saw the tension carved into men's faces. The city's air felt charged, as if a single spark could set off fresh chaos. Men whispered of Tywin's approach, of Lannister gold-buying assassins, of foreign queens with dragons. Only the promise of final judgment kept them in check. Morning arrived in a blaze of color that seemed at odds with the city's mood. The throne room had been prepared. All around, the halls bustled with lords, knights, and the rare few commoners permitted inside to bear witness. The Targaryen presence had not yet materialized, no formal invitation had been made, so Ned and Stannis set that aside for the moment. The priority was the Lannister trial. Banners of the crowned stag and of House Stark lined the entry, though no Lannister banners remained. Those had been torn down after the city fell. The Iron Throne stood at the far end, with two smaller seats erected to either side, one for the king's hand and one for the High Septon. Rows of benches had been arrayed for those with seats of honor, while behind them, space for lesser lords and knights. Beyond that, the crowd of watchers pressed anxiously. Ned arrived early, feeling a twinge of the old dread from his last time in this throne room as a prisoner. He shook it off. Now he was here to uphold justice, not to receive an unjust sentence. Ser Davos, wearing a plain surcoat with the flaming heart of Stannis' sigil, greeted him with a nod. "We expect them soon," Davos murmured, meaning Cersei and Joffrey. "The guards will escort them from the tower." Ned swallowed, memories of seeing Sansa beg for mercy for him at Joffrey's orders flitting through his mind. He breathed in, controlling his composure. They'll be defiant, no doubt. Stannis arrived shortly thereafter, clad in black and gold, a black crown set upon his short-cropped hair. His mouth was set in a hard line. He moved to the Iron Throne, ascended the steps, and lowered himself onto the seat of fused blades, wincing slightly. No matter how many cushions or adjustments were made, the throne was never comfortable. The High Septon, a tall man with an austere face, took his seat to the throne's right. Ned's hand sat to the left. The hush that fell through the hall was almost tangible. Outside, horns sounded. Sentries parted the massive doors, and infiled a procession of guards. At the center of their formation, chained but still carrying themselves with regal bearing, were Cersei Lannister and Joffrey Baratheon. Cersei wore a black gown that did nothing to hide the manacles on her wrists and ankles. Her face was pale, but her green eyes blazed with anger. Her golden hair, once so carefully maintained, was unkempt, though she still looked every inch a queen in posture. Joffrey stumbled slightly, his wrists bound before him, a fresh bruise on his cheek from some scuffle with the guards. He looked around as if searching for a lifeline, finding none. A ripple of uneasy shifting spread through the assembled watchers. Some gazed at him in disgust, others in fear. They were brought to a wooden enclosure near the foot of the throne. The clank of chains echoed, and then the hall fell silent once more. Stannis waited a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle, then spoke, voice ringing out over the crowd. "Cersei Lannister and Joffrey Baratheon," he began, giving no hint of deference to their once-held titles. "You stand accused of high treason against the crown, murder, incest, and conspiracy to hold the Iron Throne under false pretenses. You have been granted this trial to answer for your crimes." Cersei lifted her chin, eyes darting among those assembled. She recognized many who once bent the knee to her. Now they were here to watch her fall. "This is no trial," she spat. "It's a mockery. You've stolen the city, you've stolen everything. My father will have your head on a spike." Stannis' jaw tightened, but he did not rise to her bait. "Your father's whereabouts matter little to these proceedings. You will have the opportunity to speak. Then we shall hear testimony from others, and from the evidence itself, letters, records, statements of your own words, and the lineage that proves Joffrey Baratheon cannot possibly be Robert Baratheon's son." A murmur went through the crowd. The truth of Joffrey's parentage had been whispered for years, but never laid bare with such authority. Joffrey jerked on his chains, his voice emerging in a frantic shrill. "I am the king. I was crowned by the High Septon in the Great September of Baelor. You are all traitors. I'll feed you to my hounds." Laughter rippled among some in the crowd, though most looked uneasy. Ned's stomach tightened, remembering how easily Joffrey had thrown around threats. The boy had not learned a single lesson in all these months. Stannis shot a glare at Joffrey, then gestured for the hall to quiet. "We have before us the Book of Lineages," he said, and at his command, a maester stepped forward carrying a large tome. It chronicles the children of House Baratheon for generations, each of them bearing the black hair so distinctive of that line, from which I descend. Yet the children called Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were all fair-haired. More to the point, we have the testimony of the late Jon Arryn's writings and of Lord Eddard Stark, who served as hand under King Robert. They found proof of your incestuous relationship with your brother Jaime. A collective intake of breath swept the room. Cersei's eyes flared with something resembling panic, though she kept her features schooled. "Lies from a dead man," she hissed. "Jon Arryn is not here to speak." Ned felt his own voice rising gently. "No, but he left records before his murder. Records you tried to suppress. And King Robert suspected something in his final days, which led him to name Stannis as his heir in his will. I saw that document, though it was destroyed by your men. We have a copy." A hush fell over the watchers again. It was more than rumor now. An official copy had been preserved. Cersei's stare could have turned Ned to stone if she possessed the power. "Robert was a drunken fool," she sneered. "All he cared about was whoring and drinking until he died on a boar's tusk. You," she turned to Stannis, "are not fit to hold his throne. You have no claim except your own arrogance." Stannis's mouth thinned. "Robert fathered no trueborn heir, so the throne passes to me, his eldest living brother, by Westerosi law. That is the law we stand by. And if we speak of whoring, your relationship with your twin brother led to treachery that has cost thousands of lives." He motioned to the maester. "Bring forth the other evidence." The maester presented a series of letters, some from Pycelle's archives, others from Eddard Stark's own notes when he investigated the lineage. Witnesses followed. An older servant who had once overheard Jaime and Cersei in intimate conversation, a stable boy who'd witnessed them together. Few were particularly strong pieces of evidence on their own, but stacked together, they formed a near-insurmountable wall. The High Septon rose at one point to testify. "The union of incest is an abomination in the eyes of the Seven," he proclaimed, "and no child born of such a union can be rightfully recognized as legitimate. Hence, all claims Joffrey Baratheon made to the throne are null. The mother weeps for the sins that have befallen this land." It was a powerful condemnation, delivered with trembling fervor. Joffrey fidgeted, his face turning redder. "I am the king," he kept muttering, as if that alone could turn the tide. Cersei seemed to sense the inevitable end of it all. She stared out at the crowd with a kind of regal fury. When invited to speak on her own behalf, she did so with surprising calm, recounting how her father had secured Robert's marriage to her, how Robert had been a loutish husband who never loved her, how she found comfort in her brother. She painted herself as a victim of a loveless marriage forced by House Baratheon and House Lannister. Some watchers looked uncertain, but the cruelty she had shown as Queen Regent under Joffrey's reign overshadowed any pity. Even if she had been forced into marriage, it did not excuse the murders, the manipulations, the orchestrated wars. When Joffrey was asked if he would speak, he snarled at the assembly, "You're all traitors, every one of you. My father, Robert, he would never have allowed this. You took my throne. I'll have your heads." The last words devolved into a shrill outburst that turned into a near sob. His attempt to appear strong only underscored how undone he was. Nobody rushed to his defense. Stannis let the chamber quiet for a moment. Then, rising from the Iron Throne, he delivered the final question to both mother and son. "If you have any final words in your defense, speak them now. The evidence stands against you. You unlawfully claimed the throne, you conspired to kill or imprison your detractors, and you have cost the realm countless innocent lives." Cersei glared at him. "You are no true king to me," she hissed. "If this city had any justice, I would see you all torn apart. The Lannisters always pay their debts." Silence followed. Stannis inclined his head. "So be it. The court shall render judgment." He turned to the High Septon, who gave a solemn nod, acknowledging the guilt. He turned to Ned. Lord Stark, you served as hand under Robert. You discovered the truth. Yours is a voice the realm trusts. Speak of your judgment, and I will confirm or deny it." Ned stood, heart hammering. The eyes of the realm were upon him. From the corner of his vision, he glimpsed Robb. He glimpsed Catelyn's memory as well, whispering that the law must be upheld. He spoke plainly. Cersei Lannister and Joffrey Baratheon conspired to place a bastard on the throne, murdered Jon Arryn, nearly murdered my son Bran Stark, and attempted to murder me. They tore this realm apart through falsehood and cruelty. As Hand of the King, I pronounce them guilty of treason and murder. A ripple moved through the crowd. Cersei's face paled further, and Joffrey's knees seemed to shake. Stannis stepped forward, drawing the attention of all. The realm's law demands punishment for treason. The penalty is death. However, he held up a hand when Joffrey began to wail. "We are not merely dispensing vengeance. The realm has bled enough. It is my judgment that Cersei Lannister and Joffrey Baratheon be put to death swiftly, by beheading, for their crimes against the realm. The sentence shall be carried out in 3 days' time, giving them a chance to pray to the gods for forgiveness and to settle their souls." Joffrey's scream of rage filled the throne room, joined by Cersei's furious shriek. Guards moved in, hustling them away before either could attempt something desperate. The Watchers erupted in mixed roars. Some cheered, others stood pale-faced at the gravity of it. Ned felt no triumph, only a heavy sadness. So many lives lost because of the Lannisters' deception, and this was how it ended. Mother and son dragged off in chains, cursing the world. Amid the chaos, someone stepped forward from the crowd. A hush fell around them as the figure advanced. Ned could see a swirl of pale silks, glimmers of gold, and a flash of silver hair. Gasps rippled through the throng. A woman with hair the color of spun moonlight strode toward the throne. At her side walked a tall warrior with a braided beard and a curved sword, while behind her glided 2 younger men in strange, loose garb. And behind them all, a curious hush seemed to follow, as if the air itself recognized something otherworldly. She stopped at the foot of the dais. Ned realized with a start who she must be: Daenerys Targaryen. Her face was youthful yet stern, her eyes a vivid violet that roamed over the scene of Joffrey and Cersei being dragged away. When she spoke, her accent was faintly foreign but clear enough for the hall to hear. "I came to see justice done in King's Landing, yet all I see is blood and chains." A wave of murmurs broke out. The gold cloaks near Stannis tensed, unsure whether to seize this stranger. Stannis stood rigid on the steps of the throne. His eyes flicked to the 3-headed dragon sigil embroidered on Daenerys's dress, then back to her face. "And who," he said in a cold voice, "dares approach the throne unannounced?" She lifted her chin. "I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne, Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, breaker of chains, mother of dragons." Those last words hovered in the air, sending a jolt through many who heard them. The Watchers pressed closer, curiosity warring with fear. Even Stannis could not conceal the flicker in his eyes. "This is the worst possible time for another pretender to appear," he said, but his voice lacked its usual iron. Something in her bearing gave him pause. Daenerys took a slow breath, glancing at Ned, then back to Stannis. "I am not here to spill more Westerosi blood. I was born in the storm that claimed my father's seat. I have faced many trials across the sea. But I come to claim my birthright, one that was stolen from my house by Robert Baratheon. Your city is battered by war. Your people starve, and I have it in my power to help, if you would only let me." Stannis's gaze hardened at that last sentence. "A Targaryen who wishes to help. Where were you when your father burned my grandparents alive? Or when your brother Rhaegar led armies that plunged the realm into chaos? House Targaryen's crimes are not so easily forgotten." Daenerys stood straighter. "My father was the Mad King, yes. I do not deny it. I was an infant when he died. Should I bear the burden of his madness? And if so, by what right do you claim your brother Robert's throne, when he, too, did terrible things in the war, slaughtering children of Rhaegar Targaryen? hunting my brother Viserys and me without mercy? Are we each to be judged by our father's sins? The hush grew. Even Ned felt the tightness in the air. The question hung like a sword. He recalled Robert's thirst for Targaryen blood, how it had marred him, the savage joy in the sack of King's Landing. Then Ned noticed movement behind Daenerys. The two younger men parted, and from behind them crept a small shape. No, two small shapes. Dragons, each perhaps the size of a large dog, their scales glinting green and black. Collective gasp rose. Men stepped back, fear in their eyes. The creatures hissed softly, forked tongues flickering in the throne room's torchlight. Stannis' eyes widened, though he struggled to keep an aura of control. One of the dragons stretched its neck forward and made a curious keening sound, as if sniffing the air. Daenerys rested a hand on its scaled neck. "This is Rhaegal," she said softly, "named for my brother Rhaegar, and the other is Drogon." The mention of the third sibling, Viserion, hung unspoken. At the sight of actual dragons, the tension escalated. Guards reached for weapons. Stannis' jaw clenched. "You bring monsters to my throne room. Do you threaten me, Daenerys Targaryen?" "I threaten no one," she replied, voice measured. "They are my children, the last dragons in the world, perhaps. They are not here to burn your city, but they will defend me should I be attacked. I come offering an alliance, or at least a chance to speak. Your realm has been torn by war. Another threat gathers in the north, if the rumors are to be believed. The dead, walking. I have heard these stories." Ned felt a sudden kinship with her mention of the real threat. He stepped forward, meeting her gaze. "The threat beyond the wall is real, Your Grace. The Night's Watch has called for help. For if the White Walkers and Whites breach the wall, all these wars will seem trivial. King Stannis has recognized this, though we still wrestle with the realm's divisions." Daenerys nodded, her expression sober. "I have faced unnatural foes across the sea. I have no desire to see more innocents slaughtered by unstoppable horrors. I can bring armies, my own loyal followers, the Unsullied. My dragons can serve as a weapon, if we stand together. But I will not kneel to a usurper. I too have a claim." A swirl of whispered speculation filled the hall. Stannis glowered. "You call me a usurper, but you are the daughter of the Mad King who lost this throne by right of conquest. Robert's rebellion was just. I stand as his heir. The Targaryen line was broken." He paused, narrowing his eyes. "Yet here you are. Something tells me this war might never end if we add you to the list of claimants." Daenerys did not falter. "I am not demanding the throne at sword point. I want to see if you are truly the leader this realm needs. If you are not, the people will not stand behind you. They whisper in corners about the rightful Targaryen line. But if you prove yourself a wise king, one willing to protect all from the coming darkness, perhaps I will do what is best for the living. I will not emulate my father's madness." Ned studied Stannis' face. The new king was torn. He saw in Daenerys Targaryen a threat, yet also a potential ally. The knowledge that Rhaegal dragons stood before them changed everything. A single adult dragon, let alone 3, could devastate entire armies. These ones looked young still, but dragons grew quickly, if the old texts were true. This was no trifling matter. Before Stannis could respond, a stir in the hall's entrance signaled the arrival of another party. The Watchers parted, revealing a group of knights in battered armor, carrying the sunburst banner of House Martell. At their head walked a tall woman with dark, braided hair and sharp eyes. Elia Martell's name flickered through Ned's mind, but it was not her. She had died years ago. This was likely a cousin, perhaps. The Martells had long nursed hatred for the Lannisters, but also for the Targaryens in some measure. Rhaegar had married Elia Martell, then set her aside for Lyanna Stark. The entire realm's conflicts seemed to converge here. The Martell woman, who introduced herself as Lady Nemella Santagar, by the swirl of her sigil, presumably from Dorne, allied to House Martell, bowed low. "Your Grace," she addressed Stannis. "I come from Sunspear with word that Prince Doran Martell acknowledges your claim. He wishes to see justice for Elia Martell's children." murdered during the sack of King's Landing by the Lannisters. If you truly place the Lannisters on trial for their crimes, then the Martells will stand with you. Stannis glanced toward the now vacant enclosure where Joffrey and Cersei had stood. They have been found guilty already, with their executions pending. I trust that satisfies Prince Doran's sense of justice. Lady Santigar's lips curved in a thin smile. It is a start, Your Grace, but the true orchestrators of Elaya's murder were Gregor Clegane and Tywin Lannister. If Tywin Lannister remains alive, we crave his downfall. Stannis inclined his head. Tywin is yet in the field. We shall see that justice is done, if the realm stands with me to defeat him. But now we have yet another matter. He gestured to Daenerys Targaryen, who stood quietly, her dragons coiling around her ankles. This Targaryen princess also lays some claim to the throne. Dorne once was betrothed to House Targaryen. Perhaps you have opinions on that as well. Lady Santigar looked momentarily caught off balance. Her gaze flicked to the silver-haired woman, then to the dragons. The Watchers began to murmur again, as if every corner of Westeros was colliding in a single day. Dorne has little love for the Targaryens after certain betrayals, Lady Santigar said carefully. But neither do we hold to the Lannisters who murdered our people. If the Targaryen claim helps end Lannister rule and unify the realm, perhaps Dorne could be persuaded. That sent another wave of unsettled noise through the hall. Stannis's face darkened, as though he saw his authority being challenged from all sides. Ned could sympathize. This was precisely the chaos they had sought to avoid. Meanwhile, Daenerys Targaryen maintained a calm front, though Ned wondered if she was truly calm inside. Stannis lifted a hand for silence. Enough! I will not see this day turned into a carnival of competing claims. I have tried the Lannisters. They will face their sentence in 3 days. That much is decided. As for the matter of Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons, he paused, glancing at Ned. The throne is mine by law, but I will not have another war if it can be avoided. Let us convene the lords tomorrow to discuss this. We shall hear Daenerys's proposals for alliance, or else we shall find ourselves in conflict. Daenerys nodded, expression unwavering. I accept. My men are outside the city, camped near the Rose Road. I ask safe passage for them if they choose to enter the city. I will remain unarmed, as will my blood riders, if you grant the same courtesy in return. A tense hush followed, then Stannis said, So be it. Davos, see that Lady Targaryen is given suitable quarters. Our city is battered, but we can show we are not beasts. Ser Davos bowed, stepping forward to escort Daenerys. The dragons hissed softly, and the Watchers parted like waves before her as she departed. The hush of her exit hung in the air even after the large doors closed behind her. In the corner, Lady Santigar gazed with fascination, as did the other lords. Ned exhaled. The trial had concluded in condemnation and a scheduled execution. The Lannisters' final end, at least for Cersei and Joffrey, was nigh, and before the throne steps had even cooled, a Targaryen had arrived to stake her own claim. Dorne's envoy had appeared with demands for Lannister blood, and the Vale, the North, the Riverlands still loomed with unresolved tensions. In that swirl of politics and potential war, Ned could almost sense the creeping doom from the far north, beyond the wall. Stannis dismissed the assembly, instructing them to gather again on the morrow for a formal discussion. The hall emptied with a roar of voices, men talking excitedly of dragons, of Targaryen claims, of the Lannisters' upcoming execution. Ned lingered near the dais. Robb approached him, the weight of new concerns etched into his face. "Father," Robb said quietly, "do you trust this Daenerys Targaryen?" Ned considered. "I don't know her, but I sense she's no fool. She spoke of forging alliances, not war. She's been tempered by hardship, that much is clear. But whether her cause is just or not, she is still a Targaryen. Many in Westeros remember her father's madness." Robb nodded grimly. "The men will not welcome dragons with open arms. I wonder if Stannis can truly share the realm with her, or if more blood will be shed." In the midst of it all, Tywin lurks, and the White Walkers gather in the north. Ned laid a hand on Robb's shoulder. We take it one step at a time. Our first priority is to stabilize the realm. The execution in 3 days' time will remove the Lannister figureheads, but Tywin remains. As for Daenerys, maybe we can find a path to alliance. The realm cannot endure another war. Robb's gaze flicked to the battered windows. I'll see to the men. Let us at least keep peace within the city for now. The days passed in a blur of tense negotiations. Dorne's envoy pressed for Tywin's downfall. Lords from the Stormlands and the Vale bristled at Daenerys' arrival, suspicious of any Targaryen. Yet a peculiar curiosity spread among the small folk. Word that real dragons walked the city's outskirts took hold of imaginations. Some shrank in fear, while others whispered that the Targaryens might bring back the wonders of old Valyria and that Daenerys was a savior. She had freed thousands of slaves across the narrow sea, or so the stories went. She was called Breaker of Chains. That made an impression on certain corners of the city, especially among the poorest. Stannis permitted Daenerys to meet with him in a guarded solar. Ned, Robb, Ser Davos, and a handful of other trusted lords attended. Daenerys brought only 2 of her blood riders, dark, fierce men from the Dothraki Sea, and an older knight by her side with white hair and a respectful demeanor, who introduced himself as Ser Barristan Selmy, once a Kingsguard to Aerys and to Robert. The reveal of that name startled Ned. Ser Barristan had disappeared from Robert's court under suspicious circumstances, dismissed by Joffrey. Now here he was, serving the Targaryen princess. Barristan bowed humbly. My lords, it is good to stand in these halls again. I served the realm for many years under kings both just and foul. Now I serve Daenerys Targaryen, believing she will restore what was lost. Stannis had little love for Barristan, a man who once served Robert but then disappeared. But he listened to the knight's words. You speak of restoring the Targaryen line, but I hold the throne now. Why would I yield? You might say Daenerys' father lost all claim by tyranny. Daenerys, seated opposite Stannis, replied calmly. I understand your viewpoint. I am not here to demand you step down if you truly can unite the realm. But I bring resources that could help this war end faster and better. The Iron Throne is my birthright, but I have seen enough suffering to know it is worthless if all men die in war or at the hands of the dead. I propose a marriage alliance or some pact that ensures we stand as one. If you would accept me as co-ruler, or if I accept a lesser title so long as my people are safe and the White Walkers are defeated, we might find peace. Those words drew sharp intakes of breath around the table. Ned was not certain how Stannis would respond to sharing power. The new king's face darkened. Marriage alliance? I have a wife, Lady Celis. She is not someone I would set aside. Nor do I share the throne lightly. I do not believe in multiple kings. One realm, one king. That is the way of Westeros. Daenerys' expression flickered with disappointment. I see. Then perhaps a different path. I do not wish to become your enemy, Stannis Baratheon. But nor will I renounce my name. The Targaryens built the Iron Throne. If I cannot claim it peacefully, I may have to find another path. The conversation hung on a knife's edge. Robb ventured a question. What if there were another arrangement? Some form of regency, or a formal recognition that House Targaryen retains certain lands or rights, in exchange for aiding us against the Lannisters and the threat in the north. Daenerys considered this. Dragonstone was the seat of my house. If I am recognized as the Lady of Dragonstone, a Targaryen holding within the realm, I might accept that as a start. In return, I will lend my armies and my dragons to defeat Tywin Lannister. After that, the realm can focus on the White Walkers. If, in time, the realm wishes me to be queen, that can be decided by a great council. I ask only for a fair hearing, not a closed door. Stannis mulled this over. Dragonstone is my seat. I was the Lord of Dragonstone before all this. You seek to supplant me there as well. A tense silence followed. Daenerys exhaled. I do not wish to steal your seat, but that seat was House Targaryen's by right for centuries. If you would cede it back to me, it could be a gesture of peace. Or, if that is too high a price, we can find some other place. My main goal is that Targaryen blood have a recognized place in Westeros once more. If not, I fear conflict is inevitable. Ned felt the weight of the centuries pressing on them, the old grudges between Baratheon and Targaryen. But then Ser Davos spoke up, his voice a surprising calm. Your Grace, might it not be wise to secure the Targaryens' aid? If half the rumors about her dragons and her unsullied warriors are true, they could end Tywin swiftly. Then the realm can rally to face the threat in the north. If we spurn her, we risk another war. Stannis's look was flinty, but he did not dismiss Davos's words outright. Perhaps, let us consider the terms more carefully. For now, we have a more pressing matter. In 2 days, we execute Cersei and Joffrey. After that, we must decide how to deal with Tywin. If you wish to fight at our side, Daenerys Targaryen, then prove yourself. Show me you want to help the realm, and I will ensure you are not turned away. He paused. As for Dragonstone, that is a conversation to be finished when the war is done. Daenerys inclined her head. I can accept that for now. My forces stand ready outside the city, and I will keep them from pillaging. I ask for the freedom to move within the Crownlands so long as I harm no one. Let the small folk see that I bring no terror. So it was that an uneasy understanding was forged. Stannis would allow Daenerys and her entourage to remain in the Crownlands, so long as they aided in the fight against the Lannisters and recognized him as the king of Westeros for the present. Daenerys could push for a fuller claim once the wars were resolved, or once the realm convened a formal council. It was the best compromise either side could muster without unsheathing swords. The city buzzed with the news. Most men had never laid eyes on a dragon. Some claimed the creatures were small and feeble, nothing like the beasts of old Valyria. Others whispered that the dragons would grow, and soon burn the city to cinders if Daenerys was angered. Merchants and travelers from Essos began to gather outside the gates, hoping for a glimpse of the fabled Targaryen queen. Meanwhile, in taverns and squares, men drank to the upcoming spectacle of Joffrey Baratheon's end. Many believed it was well overdue. The appointed day arrived. A scaffold had been erected in the courtyard outside the Red Keep, wide enough for a large crowd to witness. Cersei and Joffrey had spent their last hours in the dungeon, receiving visits from septas who asked if they wished to repent. Joffrey raged at them. Cersei spat in their faces. No one expected an outpouring of remorse from either. Word spread that Jaime Lannister was still absent, possibly leading some faction of Tywin's forces, so he would not be present for what was to come. Ned, Robb, and many others, including Stannis and Daenerys, took positions on the castle walls or on raised platforms to watch. The sky was bright, the wind crisp, an oddly fresh day for such grim business. Tension rippled among the masses of soldiers and small folk who crowded to see the downfall of those they had once feared. The gold cloaks, now reorganized under Stannis's men, kept the peace with difficulty. Finally, the drumbeats sounded. Guards led out Cersei and Joffrey, both in tattered clothing, manacles clinking. Joffrey's face was ashen, his eyes darting wildly, still not comprehending how his world had turned upside down. Cersei walked with her head high, regal to the last, though Ned could see the tremor in her hands. She recognized that this was the end. Stannis, clad in kingly black, stepped forward onto the scaffold, flanked by Ned and Ser Davos. Cersei Lannister, he announced, voice carrying through the courtyard, and Joffrey Baratheon, found guilty of treason, incest, murder, and false kingship. The sentence is death. A roar of approval rose from parts of the crowd, though others stood silent, uneasy. The watchers parted enough for the condemned to be brought to the center, where a block awaited. Joffrey began to shriek, calling for his mother, for the Hound, for anyone to save him. Cersei's face was tight with fury and despair. She tried to speak, perhaps to hurl one last curse, but it was drowned out by the crowd's restless noise. Ned stood to the side, recalling how he once explained to his son Bran that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. Yet here Stannis had decreed the beheading, and the king's justice, wearing a black hood, stood ready with a massive sword. Ned felt no joy in the moment, only a heavy sorrow. He remembered the horrors these two had caused. Sansa's torment, the wrongful deaths, the betrayal in the throne room when Joffrey had demanded Ned's own head. Still, it was a grim spectacle. Cersei knelt first, refusing to plead. She whispered something to Joffrey that only he could hear. Perhaps it was meant to comfort him, or to promise vengeance from beyond. Joffrey whimpered as guards forced him down. The king's justice raised his sword. Stannis signaled. In a single swift motion, Cersei Lannister's head was parted from her body. Gasps and cheers intermingled in the crowd, half shocked, half exultant. Blood pooled on the scaffold's planks. Joffrey let out a scream, realizing this was real, not a nightmare. He struggled, tears streaming, babbling incoherently. The guards pinned him in place. The king's justice hesitated a moment, as if unsettled by the boy's terror, but at a nod from Stannis, the blade fell again. The courtyard erupted. Some men cheered, others shuddered. Heads on pikes might soon follow to make a statement to the realm. Up on the wall, Daenerys watched with a solemn expression, her dragons perched behind her, hissing softly. She had seen cruelty in her life, but this was Westeros's way. A public execution to finalize the downfall of House Lannister's false king. Dorne's envoy, Lady Santagar, observed from a short distance, lips pressed together in grim satisfaction. Joffrey and Cersei were dead, but the war was not over. Tywin remained, Jaime remained, Myrcella and Tommen were rumored to be in hiding. After the grisly business ended, Stannis called for order, reminding all that justice must be served to those who defy the rightful crown. The bodies were taken away, the crowd slowly dispersed, and Ned took a long breath, feeling as though a dark chapter had closed. Whether the realm would find peace now or descend further into conflict remained to be seen. That evening, a solemn feast was held in the Red Keep for lords and knights. It was more of a gathering to mark the day's events than a true celebration. Wine flowed, but the mood was subdued. Ned spotted Daenerys seated at a table with Ser Barristan, who introduced her to various lords from the Vale and the Stormlands. She spoke courteously, though many regarded her with caution. Robb sat among his northern lords, discussing strategy for confronting Tywin. Dorne's envoy conversed quietly with the Vale Knights. Partway through the feast, Ned approached Daenerys and Barristan, curiosity nudging him. He bowed slightly. "Your Grace, if I may speak freely." Daenerys gestured for him to sit. "Of course, Lord Stark. I am grateful for your willingness to see reason earlier." Ned joined them, noticing how Daenerys's dragons were absent. Likely they rested outside, away from the crowd. "I wanted to ask about Essos," he said. "You freed many slaves there, I hear. You have an army of Unsullied. Could that truly help us end the war swiftly?" Tywin Lannister still commands thousands in the west. Barristan responded with measured gravity. "My lord, the Unsullied are the finest foot soldiers in the world, disciplined beyond measure. They toppled the slave cities of Astapor and Yunkai. With them, we could crush any force Tywin brings to the field." Daenerys added, "But I do not wish to destroy Westeros. I aim to save it from further cruelty, whether from Lannisters or the White Walkers. If Stannis stands with me, we can finish the Lannisters, then turn our eyes north." Ned nodded slowly. "That would be a relief. Many men in the north are exhausted by these years of fighting. We face threats from beyond the wall, and winter is near. The realm is in dire need of unity." Daenerys's violet eyes flickered. Unity was the reason the Targaryens originally conquered the Seven Kingdoms. They believed a single throne would prevent endless petty wars. Perhaps it was a noble idea twisted by subsequent kings. If we can restore that unity now, we can stand against the long night. Ned recognized in her a passion for a cause larger than herself, something reminiscent of the best of Robert in his early days, only less rash, more tempered. "If only it were simple to unify the houses. The North crowned my son. The Vale stands separate. The Stormlands heed Stannis. The Reach is uncertain, and Dorne craves vengeance. We are scattered." Daenerys's mouth curved into a faint, sad smile. In Essos, I united freedmen from many lands and tongues. It was not easy, but it was possible. Perhaps Westeros can be the same, if we all pull in one direction. Before Ned could reply, a messenger entered the hall and approached with haste. He bowed low, handing Ned a sealed parchment. Ned recognized the wax as that of the Night's Watch. His heart quickened. He cracked it open and read, feeling the blood drain from his face. Robb, noticing, hurried over, face drawn in concern. "What is it?" Robb asked. Daenerys and Barristan also leaned in. Ned cleared his throat, meeting their eyes. "Ravens from the north. The Night's Watch at Castle Black are under attack. Whites and White Walkers have been sighted in greater numbers than ever before. A ranger patrol has gone missing, and there are rumors that Mance Rayder's wildling army is marching on the wall from beyond." A hush fell at their table, the lively feast continuing around them unaware. Robb's jaw clenched. "We cannot ignore this. Even if Tywin is undone, the realm faces oblivion if the wall falls." Daenerys exhaled softly. "Now you see why I came. I have heard tales of the dead in the far north. I would stand against them, but not if I must fight the entirety of Westeros along the way." Ned folded the parchment. "We must rally the realm. King Stannis has said he'd address the threat once Tywin was neutralized. But the threat grows faster than we expected." He stood. "I must speak to Stannis, and we must decide quickly how to proceed, or everything we've done here will be meaningless." Robb and Daenerys nodded in grim agreement. The final downfall of Cersei and Joffrey felt like a fleeting footnote in the face of this new crisis. The war for the throne might define who held power, but the war against the dead would decide if there was a realm left to rule. In that moment, among the hushed murmurs of lords and knights feasting under candlelit banners, Ned Stark realized that the days ahead would test them all as never before. Stannis, Daenerys, the North, and every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. If they could unite, they might stand a chance against the oncoming storm. If they remained divided, no throne in the world would matter once the cold darkness swept down over them all. And so the wheel turned again, the last Lannisters in King's Landing executed, the Targaryen returning from exile, and beyond the wall, the White Walkers stirring at the edge of night. The final war was only beginning.